The Wells Restaurant on 147th Street and 7th Avenue in Harlem was quiet in the early morning of July 7, 1968. The usual late-night crowd was almost gone. Only a few customers were left in the dimly lit place. At a corner table sat a well-dressed man in his early 60s. His gray hair was neat, and his suit was perfect even at this late hour. Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson, the man who had ruled Harlem's underground world for over 30 years, was eating what would be his last meal. Before we get into this amazing true story, let me know where in the world you are watching from. Type your city and what time it is where you are in the comments below. If you're ready for a trip through the shadowy streets of Harlem, hit that subscribe button, smash the like button, and share this with someone who loves true crime stories. Trust me, you don't want to miss a single detail of what comes next. The waitress had just served him coffee, a chicken leg, and hominy grits. Simple food for a man whose life had been anything but simple. As he lifted the chicken leg to his mouth, people who knew him might have seen a slight shake in his hands. Small signs that age was finally catching up to a man who had lived a life full of danger and excitement. At 1:52 a.m., Ellsworth Johnson grabbed his chest and fell forward, the chicken leg still in his hand. The heart attack was quick and final. A man who had survived many assassination tries, federal prison, and 30 years of violent street wars died peacefully in a Harlem diner. He took with him the secrets of an empire built on numbers, drugs, and a strong will that had never bowed to anyone, black or white, criminal or cop. But this ending is just the start of our story. To understand how a boy born with a bump on his head became the king of Harlem, we must go back to the beginning. We must go to a time when America was a very different country, and to a place where the seeds of a legend were first planted in the segregated South. Charleston, in 1905, was a city stuck between two worlds. The old plantation owners still held power, while new industry slowly came to the cobblestone streets. For African Americans in the Deep South, life was ruled by Jim Crow laws. These laws replaced the brutality of slavery with legal segregation and systematic oppression. It was into this world that Ellsworth Raymond Johnson was born on October 31, 1905, Halloween, a date that would seem fitting for a man who would live his life between shadow and light. His mother, Margaret Moultrie Johnson, worked as a maid, cleaning the homes of Charleston's white elite. His father, William Johnson, worked different jobs, sometimes as a laborer, sometimes as a part-time preacher at the local Baptist church. The baby's birth was difficult. He was born with a noticeable bump on the back of his head, called a cranial hematoma. It would heal but leave a permanent mark. The neighborhood kids, with the simple cruelty of children, quickly nicknamed him Bumpy. This name would follow him through life and become more famous than his real name. The Johnson home was strict but loving. Margaret Johnson was a woman of deep faith. She made sure her children went to church regularly and studied hard. She dreamed her children might escape the limits that Charleston's racial system placed on them. William Johnson, when he wasn't working, would tell young Ellsworth stories. Some were from the Bible, others were from African American folktales, but it was another family member who would have the biggest impact on young Ellsworth's future: his older brother, Willie. Willie Johnson was everything his mother feared and everything that would fascinate young Bumpy. He was handsome, charming, and completely refused to act subservient like Charleston's white society expected. Willie hung out with young black men who refused to step off the sidewalk when white people approached. They looked white men in the eye when spoken to. They added to their small legal earnings with illegal work. They ran numbers, sold illegal liquor, and sometimes stole wallets from wealthy white visitors when they had the chance. Young Ellsworth idolized his older brother. While other boys his age played with marbles, Bumpy would follow Willie at a distance. He watched as his brother did business with a smooth confidence that seemed magical to the impressionable child. Willie dressed better than any black man in Charleston, always seemed to have money, and commanded a respect that their father's humble religious life never earned. The Johnson family's stable life ended suddenly in 1915 when Bumpy was 10 years old. The details of that night were never clear. They were the kind of details families whispered about, but never said out loud. What was known was that Willie Johnson had been in a fight with a white man. The white man ended up dead, and Willie Johnson was nowhere to be found. Within days, word spread through Charleston's black community with the speed that life-threatening news always travels. The police were looking for Willie Johnson. When they couldn't find him, they began pressuring the family. In the Jim Crow South, the family of a black man accused of killing a white man was rarely safe. Even if they were innocent, Margaret Johnson made the hardest decision of her life. Gathering the few things the family could carry, she put her children on a northbound train. They left behind the only life they had ever known. Their destination was New York City, specifically Harlem, where Margaret's sister lived. She had been told black people could walk the streets with dignity there. The trip north was both a physical and a symbolic crossing. As the train took the Johnson family away from the palm trees and Spanish moss of South Carolina, they were not just changing location. They were stepping into a new world where the rules were different, the opportunities were greater, and the dangers were more subtle but just as real. For 10-year-old Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson, watching the southern countryside blur past the train window, this trip marked the end of his childhood and the start of his education in the ways of the world. He would never see Charleston again, but the lessons he learned in those early years about power, respect, and the cost of defying authority would shape every choice he made for the rest of his life. Train arrived at Penn Station on a cold November morning in 1915. Johnson family came out into the noise and chaos of New York City. They carried their few things and a big hope that this new city would give them the chances the South had denied. They could not have imagined that one of these children, the quiet boy with the bump on his head, would one day rule an empire that stretched through the very neighborhood that was about to become their new home. Harlem in 1915 was a neighborhood changing. It was a place where dreams and desperation walked hand in hand down wide streets, lined with elegant brownstone houses. What would later be called the Harlem Renaissance was already beginning. It was a cultural awakening that would make this part of Manhattan the intellectual and artistic capital of Black America. The Johnson family's first home was a small apartment on West 135th Street. They shared it with Margaret's sister, Pearl, and her husband, Samuel. The apartment was much worse than their modest but private house in Charleston, but it represented something more valuable than space or comfort. It represented possibility. Margaret Johnson quickly found work as a maid, cleaning the homes of wealthy, white families on the Upper East Side. The pay was better than anything she could have earned in Charleston. More importantly, she was treated with a basic level of human dignity that was missing in the South. Samuel worked as a porter for the Pennsylvania Railroad. Pearl took in washing and sewing to add to the family income. For young Bumpy, Harlem was a revelation. In Charleston, the limits of his world had been clearly set by the color line. Here, those limits still existed, but they were more flexible, more open to negotiation. He saw black men in fine suits walking confidently down Lenox Avenue. He saw black-owned businesses, black doctors, black lawyers, and black teachers in the public schools. But he also saw another side of Harlem, the side that would finally claim his loyalty and shape his destiny. The same freedom that let black culture grow also created chances for businesses that existed outside the law. The numbers runners, the bootleggers, the men who ran the gambling houses and secret bars. They moved through Harlem with an authority and wealth that attracted the attention of an impressionable 11-year-old boy. He had already learned that normal paths didn't always lead to respect or success. Bumpy's formal education began at public school 139, an integrated school. He proved to be smart but restless. His teachers noted he learned quickly and had a great memory, but he seemed distracted by whatever was happening outside the classroom windows. He was especially fascinated by math, showing a natural understanding of numbers and odds that would help him well in his future career. It was during his early teen years that Bumpy first met the men who would be his real teachers. Not in reading and math, but in the more practical subjects of survival and success on the streets of Harlem. These men worked in the shadows of legal society. They ran numbers games, organized dice games, and provided various services that the law forbade. But human nature demanded. The numbers game, also called policy, was the lifeblood of Harlem's underground economy. Every day, thousands of residents would place small bets, often just pennies, on 3-digit numbers. They hoped to hit the daily winner that paid out at 600 to 1 odds. The game was based on different legal numbers published in newspapers' stock trading volumes, treasury balances, or racetrack statistics. This made it seem more honest than other gambling. For many Harlem residents, playing the numbers was both fun and hope. A maid who made $8 a week might bet a nickel and dream of winning $30 more than a month's wages. The numbers game gave a daily dose of excitement and possibility in lives that often had too little of either. The men who ran the numbers were often respected figures in their communities. They provided a service people wanted. They were usually honest in their dealings. A cheated customer was a lost customer. They often served as informal bankers and social workers, giving credit during hard times and helping families in need. Young Bumpy was fascinated by these men, by their easy confidence, their fine clothes, and the way people treated them with a mix of respect and a little fear. He began hanging around the corners, where numbers runners worked. At first just watching, then slowly making himself useful by running small errands or acting as a lookout for police. One of these men, a numbers banker named Bub Hewlett, took a special interest in the smart, observant boy with the strange nickname. Hewlett was an older man in his 40s. He had been running numbers in Harlem since before Bumpy's family arrived from Charleston. He was known for his mathematical mind, his careful honesty in paying winners, and his ability to avoid police attention through a mix of bribes and careful security. Hewlett began using Bumpy for more important tasks. The boy's excellent memory made him valuable for carrying messages and bets between different places without writing anything down. This was a crucial skill in an illegal business where written records could be used as evidence in court. His youth and harmless appearance made him almost invisible to police looking for adult criminals. More importantly, Hewlett began teaching Bumpy the basic rules that govern the underground economy. The most important of these was the idea of respect. Not the kind that comes from fear, but the deeper respect that comes from being reliable, fair, and having strength of character. A man who kept his word, who treated both customers and competitors fairly, and who showed the right courage when challenged, could build a reputation worth more than any amount of money. But Hewlett also taught Bumpy about the other kind of respect, the kind that comes from a willingness and ability to use violence when needed. In a world where legal authorities offered no protection for illegal businesses, justice was a private matter. A man who could not or would not defend himself, his business, or his reputation would not stay in business long. By his 15th birthday, Bumpy was no longer just running errands for Bub Hewlett. He was learning the business from the inside. He understood how the odds were calculated, how the daily winning numbers were picked, how the profits were shared among the different levels of the organization, and how the whole operation was protected from police through a mix of bribes, threats, and political connections. But Bumpy's education was not limited to the numbers game. Harlem in the 1920s was a place where many forms of illegal business thrived side by side. Prohibition had made selling alcohol illegal in the United States. This created huge chances for those willing to break the law. The same networks that distributed number slips could distribute bottles of whiskey. The same places that served as policy shops could be secret bars after dark. Bumpy learned about importing liquor from Canada and the Caribbean, about running illegal distilleries in Harlem basements, and about the complex system of bribes that kept the liquor flowing despite federal agents. He learned about protection rackets that kept illegal businesses safe, about territory fights that sometimes turned violent, and about the delicate balance of power that kept peace between competing groups. Most importantly, he learned about the relationship between the black criminal underworld and the white power structure that ultimately controlled it, the numbers games. Secret bars and other illegal businesses in Harlem operated with the silent permission of white politicians, judges, and police officials. They got regular payments in exchange for their cooperation. This arrangement was profitable for everyone involved. But it also meant black criminals were ultimately dependent on white protectors who could take away their protection at any time. This lesson in the realities of power would be crucial to Bumpy's later success. Unlike many of his peers who saw crime as a way to rebel against white society, Bumpy understood that true power came from working within the existing system while slowly building the strength to change it. From within, his reputation was growing throughout Harlem. People began to know the name Bumpy Johnson, not as the frightened 10-year-old refugee from Charleston, but as a young man who could be trusted with important business, who kept quiet when questioned by police, and who showed the steady nerves that marked him for future leadership. But success in the criminal underworld always came with a price. And Bumpy's price was the constant attention of law enforcement. By 1921, when he was 16, he had been arrested several times on various charges: loitering, disorderly conduct, gambling. These were minor crimes that led to short jail stays, but established him as a known associate of criminal groups. These early arrests were educational experiences. Bumpy learned how the criminal justice system really worked, not how it was supposed to work. He learned about the unwritten rules that governed interactions between police and criminals, about the importance of keeping dignity under pressure, and about the value of having good lawyers and political connections. More importantly, he learned that prison was not something to fear, but something to survive and use to his advantage. The Tombs, Manhattan's famous city jail, was where Bumpy first met men who had reached legendary status in New York's criminal world. These men, bank robbers, professional killers, smart con artists, became his teachers in advanced crime. They taught him about the importance of planning and patience, about the value of reliable partners and the danger of weak links, about the art of intimidation and the science of violence. They shared stories of great successes and terrible failures, of fortunes made and lost, of friends betrayed and enemies killed. But perhaps most importantly, they taught him about the idea of honor among thieves, the idea that even in a world where lying and cheating were common tools, there were certain lines honorable men did not cross, certain codes that governed behavior even among criminals. By the time Bumpy was released from his longest early jail stay in 1923, he was no longer the wide-eyed boy who had arrived from Charleston 8 years earlier. He was an 18-year-old man with the knowledge, skills, and connections needed to succeed in Harlem's competitive criminal marketplace. But success would need more than knowledge and skills. It would need the kind of strategic thinking and ruthless decision-making that separated leaders from followers in the unforgiving world of organized crime. The stage was set for the next phase of Bumpy Johnson's education and for the events that would change him from a promising student into a force to be reckoned with on his own. The early 1920s were a critical time in Bumpy Johnson's development from street smart teenager to criminal strategist. At 18, he had the basic knowledge and connections needed for survival in Harlem's underworld, but he lacked the experience and reputation to work independently. This time would prove to be his. Graduate education in the art and science of organized crime. Harlem in the 1920s was seeing new prosperity, at least on the surface. The neighborhood had become the cultural center of Black America, attracting writers, musicians, and thinkers from across the country. The Cotton Club, the Savoy Ballroom, and many smaller places presented the best jazz music in the world to audiences of both black and white customers. Publishers, record companies, and theater producers had discovered that black culture could be very profitable. But beneath this cultural rebirth was a parallel economy, built on activities the law banned but human nature demanded. The Volstead Act, which made selling alcohol illegal in the United States, had created a huge market chance that criminal groups rushed to fill. In Harlem, this meant every legal nightclub was supplied by bootleggers. Every party had its source of illegal liquor, and every celebration needed the services of men who worked outside the law. The numbers game kept thriving alongside the liquor trade, providing daily entertainment and hope to tens of thousands of Harlem residents. But both businesses were changing in response to more competition and police pressure. The successful operators were those who could adapt to changing conditions, build effective organizations, and maintain the complex web of relationships that kept their businesses running smoothly. Bumpy Johnson was eager to move up from his role as a trusted assistant to become an independent operator. But he understood that rushing into business for himself could be deadly in a world where territory fights were often settled with guns, not lawyers. Instead of rushing, he chose to continue his training under Bub Hewlett while carefully studying the successes and failures of other criminal entrepreneurs. His chance to show leadership came in 1924. New player entered Harlem's criminal marketplace with plans to upset the existing balance of power. Vincent "Mad Dog" Call was an Irish-American gangster from the Bronx who decided Harlem's black numbers operators were easy targets to take over. Call's plan was simple and brutal. He would demand a percentage of every numbers operation in exchange for protection. Those who refused would find their businesses destroyed and their lives threatened. The established numbers bankers faced a classic extortion scheme. Their options were limited. They could pay Call's demands and accept permanent control by an outside organization. They could flee Harlem and abandon the territory they had spent years building. Or they could fight back against a well-armed and famously violent criminal organization. Most of the older numbers operators favored giving in. They had been in business long enough to know that territory wars were expensive, unpredictable, and likely to attract unwanted police attention. It was better to pay Call's tribute and keep operating profitably under his protection than to risk everything in a violent fight they might not survive. But Bumpy Johnson argued for a different approach. At 19, he was young enough to take risks his older colleagues found unacceptable. He was also smart enough to understand that giving in to Call would set a pattern that would eventually destroy the independence of Harlem's black criminal organizations. If they paid tribute to one outside organization, others would soon follow with similar demands. Soon, the whole illegal economy of Harlem would be controlled by white criminals who contributed nothing but threats to the businesses they parasitically exploited. Bumpy's strategic analysis was advanced for someone his age. He saw that Call's main advantage was his reputation for violence, not his actual firepower or number of men. Most of Call's victims had surrendered without a fight because they believed resistance was useless. But if someone could show that Call was not unbeatable, if his reputation could be damaged by a successful act of defiance, then his extortion scheme would start to fall apart. Working with a small group of like-minded young criminals, Bumpy began planning a response. It would send a message to Call without starting the kind of all-out war that would destroy everyone involved. The plan needed careful timing, reliable information, and the willingness to accept big personal risk in pursuit of strategic advantage. On a cold, February night in 1924, Vincent Cowell was leaving a secret bar on 125th Street when he discovered someone had stolen his Cadillac. The car was found 3 days later, burned to a shell in a vacant lot in the Bronx. Attached to the steering wheel was a note that read, simply, "Harlem pays tribute to no one." The message was clear. More importantly, it was effective. Cowell could not ignore this direct challenge to his authority, but he also could not figure out who was responsible. His attempts to fight back were frustrated by the closed-mouth solidarity of the Harlem community, which refused to help his investigations. After several weeks of failed threats, Cowell decided the profits from Harlem were not worth the trouble, and moved his operations elsewhere. The successful resistance to Cowell's extortion scheme established Bumpy Johnson's reputation as a strategic thinker and leader. He had shown he could analyze complex problems, develop effective solutions, and carry out plans that needed coordination among multiple people. More importantly, he had shown he was willing to take personal risks for the good of the broader community, a quality that would help him well in his later rise to power. But success also brought scrutiny from law enforcement. They were beginning to recognize Bumpy as a significant figure in Harlem's criminal hierarchy. Detective Lieutenant James McBride of the NYPD's gambling squad had been tracking numbers operations in Harlem for several years. He understood that resisting Cowell's extortion needed a level of organization and leadership that suggested a new power structure in the neighborhood's illegal economy. McBride was a skilled investigator who had built his career on understanding the personal dynamics that drove criminal organizations. He knew the key to disrupting these organizations was not to arrest every low-level operator, but to identify and target the leaders whose vision and management skills held the whole structure together. In Bumpy Johnson, he believed he had found such a leader. The detective began building a case against Bumpy using the traditional tools of law enforcement: informants, surveillance, and systematic pressure on arrested associates to encourage cooperation. But he quickly discovered Bumpy was a more sophisticated target than most criminals his age and experience. First, Bumpy's operational security was excellent. He rarely handled money or gambling materials directly. Instead, he relied on trusted assistants to manage the day-to-day details of illegal businesses. When he met with associates, he chose locations and methods that minimized the chance of surveillance. Most importantly, he had built a reputation for loyalty and fairness that made his associates reluctant to cooperate with police, even when facing significant jail time. Second, Bumpy understood the importance of political and legal protection. He built relationships with influential lawyers, bail bondsmen, and political figures who could help when legal problems came up. He also kept a fund specifically for legal expenses and family support for associates who were arrested. This practice ensured loyalty and reduced the temptation to cooperate with prosecutors. Finally, Bumpy had learned to diversify his activities in ways that made it hard for police to build complete cases against him. Instead of focusing only on numbers, running, or liquor distribution, he kept interests in multiple illegal businesses while also investing in legal businesses that provided both income and cover for his other activities. The cat-and-mouse game between Bumpy Johnson, Detective McBride continued through 1925 and 1926. Each man tried to outmaneuver the other while keeping the appearance of normal business activities. McBride's investigation led to many arrests of Bumpy's associates, but never the decisive evidence needed to prosecute Bumpy himself on serious charges. The stalemate finally broke in early 1927. One of Bumpy's trusted assistants was arrested with a large amount of Policy slips and cash during a raid on a numbers operation. Faced with a possible 10-year sentence for organized gambling, the assistant agreed to cooperate with prosecutors in exchange for a reduced sentence. His testimony provided the missing link Detective McBride had been looking for. Direct evidence of Bumpy's leadership role in a major criminal organization. On March 15, 1927, Bumpy Johnson was arrested. He was charged with conspiracy to violate the state's gambling laws, a felony that carried a possible sentence of 5 to 15 years in state prison. The arrest was both a setback and an opportunity for Bumpy's criminal education. The setback was obvious. He would likely serve significant prison time during what should have been the most productive years of his criminal career, but the opportunity lay in the chance to study and learn from some of the most successful criminals in New York, men who were serving time in the state's maximum security prisons for crimes from robbery to murder. Bumpy's trial happened in the fall of 1927. Despite the testimony of his former assistant, the case was closer than prosecutors had expected. Bumpy's lawyer, a skilled criminal defender named Morris Rothstein, argued his client was a legal businessman who had been set up by corrupt police officers, trying to advance their careers by prosecuting an innocent man. The strategy was partly successful. Instead of the major felony conviction prosecutors wanted, Bumpy was convicted on reduced charges that carried a sentence of 2 to 5 years. He was sentenced to serve his time at Sing Sing, New York's famous maximum security prison. There he would get an education in advanced criminal methods from some of the most successful and ruthless criminals in the country. As the prison transport took him north, along the Hudson River toward the gray walls of Sing Sing, 22-year-old Bumpy Johnson thought about the lessons of the last few years. He had learned about leadership and organization, about loyalty and betrayal, about the complex relationships between criminals, law enforcement, and the legal political system. But most importantly, he had learned about himself, about his own ability for strategic thinking, his willingness to take calculated risks, and his ability to inspire loyalty in others. The next phase of his education would happen behind bars, where the stakes were higher and the lessons more brutal than anything he had experienced on the streets of Harlem. But he was confident he would come out of prison stronger, smarter, and better prepared for the challenges waiting for him in the criminal underworld of the 1930s. Young man who entered Sing Sing in November 1927 was no longer the frightened child refugee from Charleston, or the eager teenage student of his early years in Harlem. He was an experienced criminal leader with his own ideas about how illegal businesses should be organized and run. When he finally returned to Harlem, he would be ready to put those ideas into action and to challenge anyone who stood in his way. The Great Depression had changed America by the time Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson walked out of Sing Sing prison. On a cold February morning, 1932, the stock market crash of 1929 and the economic collapse that followed had devastated legal businesses across the country. But it had also created unprecedented chances for businesses that operated outside the boundaries of law and normal morality. Unemployment in Harlem was almost 50%. Many families survived only through a combination of government relief, private charity, and the small profits from illegal activities like numbers running and bootlegging. The very desperation that made life hard for most residents also created a huge customer base for the gambling, liquor, and other services criminal organizations provided. Bumpy Johnson had spent 4.5 years in Sing Sing. He used that time to complete his education in the criminal arts. The prison population included men who had taken part in some of the most sophisticated criminal enterprises in American history. Bank robbers who had perfected their techniques during the wild early 1920s, con artists who could separate wealthy targets from fortunes without ever using violence, professional killers who had made murder a precise science. But the most important, relationships Bumpy formed in prison were with other young men who shared his ambitions and his understanding that the criminal underworld was changing in ways that would create chances for those smart enough to see and use them. These men, black, white, Italian, Irish, Jewish, came from different backgrounds and different neighborhoods. But they shared a common vision of criminal enterprise as a sophisticated business that needed the same skills as any legal corporation: strategic planning, financial management, personnel development, and market analysis. One of these men was Joseph "Joe" Bonanno, a young Sicilian American who would later become one of New York's most powerful mafia leaders. Despite the racial prejudices of the time, Bonanno recognized Bumpy's intelligence and leadership potential. The two men developed a mutual respect that would prove crucial to both their careers. From Bonanno, Bumpy learned about the organizational structure of traditional Sicilian crime families, about the importance of omerta, the code of silence, that protected criminal organizations, and about the sophisticated methods Italian-American criminals used to infiltrate and control legal businesses. Another important relationship was with Meyer Lansky, a Jewish-American criminal already recognized as one of the smartest financial minds in organized crime. Lansky taught Bumpy about money laundering, about setting up legal businesses as fronts for illegal activities, and about the complex web of political and legal corruption that protected major criminal enterprises from police interference. Perhaps most importantly, Bumpy formed a close friendship with Frank Lucas, a young black man from North Carolina who shared his vision of black criminal organizations that could operate independently of white control. Lucas, who would later become famous as the subject of the movie American Gangster, learned from Bumpy the importance of keeping dignity and respect while operating in a world where racial prejudice was constant. These relationships were not just personal friendships. They represented strategic alliances that would reshape the structure of organized crime in New York for decades. The traditional barriers between different ethnic criminal organizations were starting to break down as smart leaders recognized that cooperation was more profitable than competition. When Bumpy returned to Harlem in 1932, he found a neighborhood that had changed dramatically during his absence. The cultural rebirth of the 1920s had given way to economic desperation. Many of the legal businesses that had provided the foundation for the community's prosperity had closed or were struggling to survive. But the illegal economy had grown stronger, not weaker, as residents turned to gambling, bootlegging, and other criminal activities to add to their reduced legal incomes. The numbers game in particular had evolved into a highly sophisticated business that made millions of dollars a year. The simple penny bets of Bumpy's youth had given way to a complex system of multiple daily drawings, elaborate mathematical calculations for picking winning numbers, and professional management structures that rivaled those of legal corporations. But the most important change was in leadership. Many of the older numbers bankers who had controlled Harlem's illegal economy during the 1920s had either died, retired, or been eliminated by younger, more aggressive competitors. The field was open for someone with the vision, skills, and ruthless determination needed to build a new kind of criminal organization. Bumpy Johnson was ready to be that someone. His first step was to re-establish his presence in the neighborhood and reconnect with old associates who had stayed loyal during his imprisonment. These men numbers runners, secret bar operators, and small-time criminals gave him the basic information and manpower needed to begin operations. But Bumpy understood that building a successful criminal organization needed more than just loyal followers. It needed a clear strategy and the resources to carry out that strategy against determined opposition. His strategy was based on three basic principles he had developed during his years in prison. First, vertical integration. Instead of specializing in one illegal activity, he would control every aspect of multiple criminal enterprises, from street-level operations to high-level financial management. Second, territorial expansion. Instead of accepting the existing boundaries between different criminal organizations, he would systematically expand his influence throughout Harlem and into other neighborhoods where chances existed. Third, political protection. Instead of just bribing individual police officers and low-level officials, he would build relationships with judges, prosecutors, and elected officials who could provide complete protection for his activities. Carrying out this strategy needed money. Bumpy's first priority was to generate the cash needed to fund his expansion plans. He began by taking control of several small numbers operations that had been poorly managed during his absence. He used a combination of negotiation, threats, and violence to persuade their operators to accept his leadership or leave the business. His reputation from before his imprisonment, enhanced by stories about his conduct in prison, gave him big advantages in these negotiations. Men who might have resisted a complete unknown were willing to work with someone known to be intelligent, fair in his business dealings, and absolutely ruthless toward anyone who betrayed or cheated him. Within 6 months of his release, Bumpy controlled a network of numbers operations that made several $1,000s a week in profits. This was modest by the standards he would later reach, but enough to fund the next phase of his expansion plans. He used these profits to recruit more personnel, to buy better equipment and weapons, and to begin the systematic bribing of police officers and court officials that would protect his operations from police interference. But his most important early decision was to avoid direct confrontation with the established criminal powers in Harlem. Instead of challenging the existing leaders head-on, he positioned himself as a partner and ally who could help them expand their own operations while building his independent power base. This approach let him grow strong enough to eventually challenge them without starting the kind of early war that had destroyed many promising criminal careers. His first major partnership was with Stephanie St. Clair, known as Queenie, who controlled the most profitable numbers operation in Harlem.St. Claire was a remarkable woman, a French-speaking immigrant from Martinique who had built a criminal empire through a combination of shrewd business sense and absolute fearlessness. She was one of the few criminals, male or female, who had successfully resisted efforts by white gangsters to take over her operations.St. Claire recognized in Bumpy a kindred spirit, someone who understood that criminal success needed more than just violence and threats. She offered him a junior partnership in her organization, with the chance to learn her methods while contributing his own skills and connections. For Bumpy, the partnership provided both immediate profits and access to the sophisticated organizational methods that had made St. Clair one of the most successful criminals in New York. The partnership with Queenie St. Clair proved to be one of the most important relationships of Bumpy's career. From her, he learned about the financial management of large-scale illegal enterprises, about the importance of keeping detailed records despite the risks involved, and about the delicate art of managing relationships with corrupt officials at every level of government. More importantly, he learned about the specific challenges faced by black criminals operating in a society dominated by white power structures.St. Claire had achieved success by refusing to accept the limits others tried to place on her because of her race and gender. She dealt directly with suppliers, distributors, and officials instead of accepting lower positions in organizations controlled by white men. She kept her independence through a combination of superior intelligence, careful planning, and the willingness to use violence when negotiation failed. But she also understood the importance of strategic alliances. Her partnership with Bumpy was designed to strengthen her position against the growing threat posed by Dutch Schultz, a white gangster who was systematically taking over black-owned illegal businesses throughout Harlem. Schultz's methods were brutally simple. He would offer to protect existing operations in exchange for a big percentage of their profits. Those who refused would find their businesses destroyed and their lives threatened. The conflict with Dutch Schultz would define the next phase of Bumpy Johnson's career and establish him as one of the most important criminal leaders in New York. Arthur Flegenheimer, known as Dutch Schultz, was a Bronx-born gangster who had built a criminal empire based on bootlegging, numbers running, and protection rackets. By 1933, he controlled illegal gambling operations throughout Manhattan and was expanding into Harlem with plans to dominate this neighborhood's lucrative numbers game. Schultz's approach to business was fundamentally different from that of the established Harlem operators, where they saw the numbers game as a community service that provided entertainment and hope to residents. While making profits for operators, Schultz saw it simply as a source of money to be exploited as efficiently as possible. He had no interest in maintaining the relationships with players and community leaders that had made the numbers game successful in Harlem. He wanted only to take maximum profits with minimum investment. Conflict began in earnest in late 1933 when Schultz's enforcers began demanding tribute from numbers operators throughout central Harlem. Several smaller operators immediately agreed to his terms, preferring to pay protection money rather than risk violent retaliation. But the larger operators, led by St. Clair and supported by Bumpy Johnson, decided to resist. The war that followed was unlike anything Harlem had experienced before. Previous conflicts between criminal organizations had been relatively limited, involving a few key players and lasting only until one side achieved clear control. But the conflict with Schultz escalated into a neighborhood-wide battle that lasted over 2 years and resulted in dozens of deaths. Bumpy Johnson emerged as the tactical leader of the resistance. He planned and coordinated attacks on Schultz's operations while protecting St. Clair's business from retaliation. His prison education proved invaluable as he applied lessons learned from experienced criminals to the challenges of urban warfare. He organized his forces into small, independent units that could strike quickly and disappear before police arrived. He established safe houses and communication networks that allowed coordination without centralized vulnerability. Most importantly, he kept the discipline and morale needed for a long campaign. The turning point came in 1935, when Bumpy orchestrated a series of coordinated attacks. They destroyed several of Schultz's key operations and killed or wounded most of his top assistants in Harlem. The attack showed Schultz was not unbeatable and encouraged other black criminals to join the resistance. More importantly, they convinced several corrupt police officials to switch sides. They calculated that Bumpy and St. Clair were more likely to win than Schultz. Schultz's response was characteristically brutal. He increased the violence of his attacks and began targeting not just criminal competitors, but also legal community leaders who supported the resistance. This escalation proved to be a strategic mistake. It turned the broader Harlem community against him and attracted unwanted attention from federal law enforcement officials looking for chances to prosecute major criminals. The end came suddenly and dramatically on October 23, 1935. Dutch Schultz was shot and killed while eating dinner at a restaurant in Newark, New Jersey. The assassination was carried out by members of Murder, Inc., the enforcement arm of the National Crime Syndicate. On orders from other major criminal leaders, they had decided Schultz's violent methods were attracting too much law enforcement attention to organized crime. With Schultz's death, his criminal organization collapsed almost immediately. His assistants lacked both the intelligence and the political connections needed to maintain his empire. Most of his operations were quickly absorbed by other criminal organizations in Harlem. This meant the numbers game and other illegal businesses returned to local control, with Bumpy Johnson and Stephanie St. Clair emerging as the dominant powers in the neighborhood's criminal underworld. The victory over Dutch Schultz established Bumpy Johnson's reputation as one of the most formidable criminal leaders in New York. He had shown the ability to plan and carry out a successful military campaign against a powerful and ruthless opponent. More importantly, he had done so while keeping the respect and support of the Harlem community. They saw him not as an exploitative outsider like Schultz, but as a local leader protecting their interests against external threats. But success also brought new challenges and responsibilities. As the undisputed leader of Harlem's criminal underworld, Bumpy was now responsible for keeping order among dozens of different illegal enterprises while protecting them all from police interference. He needed to resolve disputes between competing operators, negotiate agreements with corrupt officials, and plan for future threats and opportunities. Most importantly, he needed to transform his wartime organization into a peacetime business structure that could generate steady profits while minimizing risks. This transformation would need all the organizational and management skills he had developed over the previous decade. It would establish the foundation for the criminal empire that would make him one of the most powerful men in Harlem for the next 30 years. By 1936, Bumpy Johnson had achieved what many considered impossible. He had become the undisputed king of Harlem's numbers racket while keeping the respect and admiration of the very community he was technically exploiting. Unlike the white gangsters who had tried to force their way into Harlem's illegal economy, Bumpy understood that sustainable criminal success needed more than just violence and threats. It needed genuine community support and a business model that served the needs of both operators and customers. The numbers game that Bumpy inherited and transformed was far more complex than the simple gambling operation outsiders imagined. At its most basic level, the game let residents bet small amounts of money, often as little as a penny, on 3-digit numbers. Winners received payouts at odds of 600 to 1, but this simple description barely captured the social, economic, and cultural importance of what had become Harlem's most important institution. For most players, the daily numbers bet was not simply gambling. It was a form of banking, investment, and insurance combined into one transaction. A maid who earned $8 a week might bet a nickel every day, not because she expected to win, but because the possibility of winning provided psychological relief from the grinding poverty of daily life. When she did win, the $30 payout was enough to pay rent for a month, buy food for her family, or handle an emergency that would otherwise have been catastrophic. The numbers game also served as an informal banking system for a community largely excluded from legal financial institutions. Players could place bets on credit during difficult times, with the understanding they would settle their accounts when their financial situations improved. Successful players could use their winnings as collateral for small loans from numbers operators, who often served as community bankers for residents who could not get credit from traditional sources. Most importantly, the numbers game provided jobs for thousands of Harlem residents who had few other chances for economic advancement. Numbers runners, collectors, and clerks earned steady incomes that were often better than what they could get from legal employment. The most successful could advance to become operators of their own territories, achieving financial independence and community respect that would have been impossible in the segregated legal economy of the 1930s. Bumpy Johnson understood these dynamics better than any of his competitors or predecessors. He structured his organization to maximize both profits and community support. Instead of simply taking money from the neighborhood, he reinvested a big portion of his profits in legal businesses, community organizations, and individual assistance that benefited the broader population. His legal investments included restaurants, barber shops, funeral homes, and small retail stores that provided jobs for community members and served as fronts for his illegal activities. These businesses were run honestly and efficiently, providing real services to customers while making profits that could be reported to tax authorities as legal income. His community investments included big contributions to churches, schools, and charitable organizations that served Harlem's neediest residents. During the worst years of the Great Depression, Bumpy's organization distributed food, clothing, and cash assistance to families that might otherwise have faced starvation or homelessness. These contributions were made quietly, without publicity or acknowledgement, but they established Bumpy as a community leader whose criminal activities were balanced by genuine concern for his neighbors' welfare. Perhaps most importantly, Bumpy established a reputation for absolute fairness and honesty in his business dealings. Numbers winners always got their full payouts promptly and without argument. Employees were paid fair wages and treated with respect. Disputes were resolved through negotiation rather than violence whenever possible. This approach was not just morally admirable, it was also good business, as satisfied customers and employees were far more likely to stay loyal and protect the organization from police interference. The organizational structure Bumpy created to manage his expanding empire was a masterpiece of criminal administration. It balanced efficiency with security. At the top was Bumpy himself, who made all major strategic decisions while keeping enough distance from day-to-day operations to minimize his legal exposure. Below him were trusted assistants, who managed different aspects of the business: collections, payouts, security, and relationships with corrupt officials. Actual street-level operations were managed through a cellular structure that limited the damage that could be caused by arrests or infiltration. Each cell consisted of a small number of runners, collectors, and clerks who knew only their immediate associates and had no information about the broader organization. If police arrested members of one cell, the others could keep operating with minimal disruption. Communication between different levels of the organization was handled through a system of coded messages, pre-arranged meeting places, and trusted go-betweens that made surveillance extremely difficult. Financial records were kept to a minimum and were frequently destroyed to prevent their use as evidence in criminal prosecutions. But perhaps the most innovative aspect of Bumpy's organizational design was his integration of legal and illegal activities in ways that provided both cover and extra profits. His restaurants and retail stores served as collection points for numbers bets and as meeting places for criminal associates. His investments in real estate provided safe houses and operational bases that could not easily be raided by police. His relationships with legal community leaders gave him advance warning of law enforcement activities and political developments that might affect his operations. The financial success of this integrated approach was remarkable. By 1938, Bumpy's organization was making over $100,000 a year in profits, an enormous sum during the Great Depression, equal to several $1 million today. These profits let him expand his operations beyond Harlem into other black neighborhoods throughout New York, increase his political contributions and bribery payments, and accumulate the personal wealth that would make him one of the richest black men in America. But success also attracted the attention of competitors who wanted to share in his profits and law enforcement officials who recognized he had become too powerful to ignore. The challenge for Bumpy was to maintain and expand his criminal empire, while defending it against threats from multiple directions. The most serious competitive threat came from the Italian-American crime families that controlled much of New York's organized criminal activity. These families had traditionally shown little interest in black neighborhoods like Harlem, preferring to focus on more profitable opportunities in white areas of the city. But Bumpy's success had shown that black communities could generate substantial profits for those smart enough to organize them effectively. The Italian family's approach to expansion was typically direct. They would offer to protect existing operations in exchange for a percentage of profits. Those who refused would face escalating violence until they either gave in or were eliminated. Several smaller numbers operators in Harlem had already agreed to these arrangements, preferring to pay tribute rather than risk confrontation with the powerful crime families. But Bumpy Johnson was not like the smaller operators who had given in to Italian control. He had his own organization, his own resources, and his own vision of how criminal enterprises should be managed. More importantly, he had something the Italian families lacked: the complete support of the Harlem community, which saw him as their protector against outside exploitation. The conflict began in earnest in 1939 when representatives of the Luciano crime family approached Bumpy with an offer to become their partner in expanding numbers operations throughout black neighborhoods in New York. The offer was presented as an opportunity, but Bumpy understood it was actually an ultimatum: accept lower status in a white-controlled organization or face the consequences of refusal. His response was characteristically direct and uncompromising. He told the Italian representatives that Harlem's numbers game would stay under local control, that he had no interest in partnerships that would reduce his independence, and that anyone who tried to interfere with his operations would face serious retaliation. The Italian family's response was equally direct. Within a week, 2 of Bumpy's numbers runners were beaten nearly to death, and several of his collection points were firebombed. The message was clear: submit to Italian control or face escalating violence that would eventually destroy his organization. But Bumpy had learned important lessons from his earlier conflict with Dutch Schultz. He was better prepared for this confrontation than his enemies expected. He had spent years building relationships with corrupt police officials willing to protect his interests in exchange for regular payments. He had accumulated enough cash reserves to fund a long conflict. Most importantly, he had developed strategic alliances with other black criminal leaders throughout New York who shared his determination to keep independence from white control. The war that followed was conducted with a sophistication that surprised law enforcement officials who had underestimated the organizational capabilities of black criminals. Instead of engaging in random violence that would attract unwanted attention, both sides conducted targeted attacks designed to weaken their opponents while minimizing collateral damage that might turn public opinion against them. Bumpy's strategy was based on the principle of asymmetric warfare. He could not match the Italian family's resources and firepower, but he could make their expansion into Harlem so expensive and dangerous, they would eventually decide to seek easier opportunities elsewhere. His tactics included systematic attacks on Italian-controlled businesses in black neighborhoods, the elimination of corrupt officials who supported Italian interests, and the recruitment of Italian criminals who were dissatisfied with their treatment by their own families. The turning point came in 1941 when Bumpy negotiated a strategic alliance with Meyer Lansky, the Jewish-American criminal who had become one of the most powerful figures in organized crime. Lansky, who had known Bumpy since their time together in Sing Sing, recognized that Italian expansion into black neighborhoods threatened the delicate balance of power that had let different ethnic crime groups coexist profitably. With Lansky's support, Bumpy was able to negotiate a peace agreement that preserved his independence while giving the Italian families face-saving concessions. The agreement established clear territorial boundaries that kept Italian operations out of Harlem while letting them expand into other areas without interference. More importantly, it recognized Bumpy as an equal partner in the loose confederation of crime families that controlled organized criminal activity in New York. The peace agreement of 1941 marked the end of Bumpy Johnson's rise to power and the beginning of his reign as the undisputed king of Harlem's underworld. He had achieved something few black criminals had ever accomplished. He had built and maintained an independent criminal empire that operated on equal terms with the most powerful crime families in America. But success also brought new responsibilities. and challenges that would test his leadership skills for the next quarter century. As the acknowledged leader of Harlem's criminal underworld, he would need to keep order among dozens of competing interests, while adapting to changing conditions in both the legal and illegal economies. The next phase of his career would be defined by his ability to balance the demands of criminal leadership with his growing involvement in the social and political movements beginning to transform American society. The Bumpy Johnson who emerged from the conflicts of the late 1930s and early 1940s was no longer just a successful criminal. He was a community leader whose influence extended far beyond the boundaries of a legal enterprise. The Bumpy Johnson, who ruled Harlem's underworld in the 1940s, was a study in contradictions that perfectly embodied the complexity of his era and community. By day, he might be found in his legal businesses, a well-appointed office above his restaurant on Lenox Avenue, discussing real estate investments with lawyers and accountants. By night, he presided over an illegal empire that made more money than most legal corporations. But it was the man himself, rather than his businesses, that captured the imagination of Harlem residents and made him a legendary figure whose influence extended far beyond the world of crime. Bumpy's personal style was legendary throughout Harlem and beyond. He dressed in custom-tailored suits from the finest clothiers, preferring dark colors that emphasize his imposing physical presence while conveying the dignity and authority essential to his leadership position. His shirts were made of the finest cotton and silk. His shoes were handcrafted Italian leather. His accessories, watches, cufflinks, tie pins, were chosen not for their showiness, but for their understated elegance. But his attention to appearance went deeper than mere vanity or desire to display wealth. In a society where black men were systematically denied respect and dignity, Bumpy's impeccable appearance was itself a form of rebellion in leadership. He showed that black men could present themselves with the same sophistication and authority as the white power brokers who controlled legal society. His style inspired countless imitators throughout Harlem, from successful businessmen to street-level numbers runners who saved their money to buy one good suit that would let them copy their leader's dignity. His intellectual interests were equally impressive and unexpected. Bumpy was a voracious reader who kept extensive libraries in both his home and office, filled with works of history, philosophy, poetry, and literature. He was particularly drawn to the writings of Marcus Garvey, whose philosophy of black nationalism and economic independence resonated with his own experiences as a criminal leader who had refused to accept subordination to white criminal organizations. But his reading was not limited to works by black authors or about black experiences. He studied the strategies and philosophies of great military leaders throughout history, from Sun Tzu to Napoleon Bonaparte, seeking insights that could be applied to managing his criminal organization. He read extensively about economics and business management, understanding that successful criminal enterprises needed the same skills as legal corporations. Perhaps most surprisingly, Bumpy was himself a poet whose work was known throughout Harlem's intellectual circles. His poetry dealt with themes of struggle, dignity, and the complex relationships between power and responsibility. His verses were often quoted in barbershops and bars, passed along through oral tradition in a community where poetry was valued as both entertainment and wisdom. One of his most famous poems, written during the height of his power in the mid-1940s, captured both his philosophical outlook and his understanding of his position in society. Asterisk. The streets don't choose their kings. They crown the ones who understand that power ain't about the bling. It's about the helping hand. A crown ain't worth the medal if the people don't believe that the man who wears it settles. Asterisk. Asterisk. What makes them grieve? Asterisk. This combination of intellectual sophistication and street credibility made Bumpy unique among criminal leaders of his era. While other crime bosses were known primarily for their capacity for violence or their ability to generate profits, Bumpy was recognized as a thinker and philosopher whose ideas about leadership, community, and social justice influenced people far beyond the criminal underworld. His philosophy of criminal leadership was based on several basic principles that distinguished his approach from that of conventional gangsters. First, he believed successful criminal organizations had to serve the communities in which they operated. Crime bosses who simply took wealth without providing any benefits to local residents would eventually face resistance that would destroy their operations. Second, he understood that long-term criminal success needed the same virtues valued in legal society: honesty in business dealings, loyalty to associates, fair treatment of employees, and consistent application of rules and standards. Criminal organizations based purely on fear and threats were inherently unstable and would eventually collapse when their leaders showed weakness or faced serious challenges. Third, he believed black criminals had special responsibilities to their communities that white criminals did not face. Because black communities were systematically excluded from legal sources of capital, credit, and economic opportunity, black criminal leaders had an obligation to reinvest their profits in ways that would benefit the broader population. Finally, he recognized that criminal leadership in a racially segregated society required a delicate balance between challenging white authority and avoiding the kind of direct confrontation that would bring devastating retaliation. Black criminals who became too powerful or too visible would eventually face coordinated attacks from law enforcement, legal political leaders, and white criminal organizations that would be difficult to survive. These philosophical principles were not just abstract ideas. They were practical guidelines Bumpy applied to every aspect of his criminal operations. His numbers game was run with careful honesty, with winners always getting their full payouts and disputes resolved fairly and promptly. His employees were paid regular wages that were often better than what they could earn in legal employment. They received bonuses, medical assistance, and other benefits rare in both legal and illegal businesses of the era. His relationship with law enforcement was based on mutual respect rather than simple bribery. While he certainly paid corrupt officials for protection and information, he also kept his end of implicit agreements that limited his activities in ways that let police keep order and avoid embarrassing public scandals. When violence was necessary, it was applied precisely and proportionally, designed to resolve specific problems rather than to terrorize opponents into submission. Perhaps most importantly, his community investments were substantial and genuine. He provided financial support for churches, schools, and charitable organizations throughout Harlem. He sponsored sports teams and cultural events that gave young people positive alternatives to criminal activity. He provided emergency assistance to families facing eviction, medical crisis, or other disasters that could not be handled through legal social services. These community investments were not simply public relations gestures designed to buy goodwill. They reflected Bumpy's genuine understanding that his own success depended on the health and stability of the neighborhood where he operated. A community that was prosperous, educated, and well-organized was better able to support the illegal businesses that generated his profits and to resist interference from outside law enforcement agencies and criminal organizations. The effectiveness of this approach was shown by the remarkable loyalty Bumpy inspired among Harlem residents at every level of society. Legal businessmen, religious leaders, and community activists who publicly opposed gambling and other illegal activities privately acknowledged that Bumpy's leadership had brought stability and prosperity to their neighborhood. Even middle-class professionals, who had no direct involvement with criminal activities, recognized that Bumpy's presence protected them from exploitation by outside criminals and provided economic opportunities unavailable through legal channels. This community support was Bumpy's most valuable asset and his most effective protection against police interference. Police investigations of his activities were consistently frustrated by the unwillingness of potential witnesses to cooperate. Federal agents who tried to infiltrate his organization found their activities were quickly reported to Bumpy by community members who viewed them as outside threats to local stability. More importantly, the political leaders who controlled law enforcement policy understood that attacking Bumpy's organization would be extremely unpopular with their black constituents, who saw him as a protector and benefactor rather than a criminal threat. As long as his activities were limited to illegal businesses that served community needs without threatening public order, most politicians preferred to ignore his existence rather than risk the political consequences of moving against him. This political protection let Bumpy operate with remarkable openness for a criminal leader. He kept regular office hours in his legal businesses, where community members could seek his assistance with personal problems or business opportunities. He attended public events, church services, political rallies, cultural celebrations where his presence was welcomed by organizers who recognized his influence and contributions to community life. But perhaps the most remarkable aspect of Bumpy's public persona was his role as an informal mediator and problem solver for disputes that could not be resolved through legal channels. Harlem residents who faced problems with landlords, employers, or government agencies often sought his intervention, knowing his reputation and connections could produce results impossible through normal legal processes. His success in these mediations was based on his reputation for fairness and his ability to bring pressure to bear on people who might ignore the complaints of ordinary citizens. A landlord who refused to make necessary repairs might find himself facing unexpected problems with building inspectors or tax collectors. An employer who cheated workers might discover his business was no longer welcome in certain neighborhoods. A government official who treated black citizens with disrespect might find his political support had mysteriously disappeared. These interventions were always conducted quietly and diplomatically, without public acknowledgement of Bumpy's role. But their effectiveness was well known throughout Harlem, and they contributed to his reputation as a leader who used his power to protect his community rather than simply to enrich himself. By the mid-1940s, Bumpy Johnson had achieved a unique position in American society. He was simultaneously one of the most successful criminals in the country and one of the most respected community leaders in Harlem. His influence extended into legal business, politics, and social activism, while his criminal empire provided the financial resources and organizational structure that made his community leadership possible. But this remarkable success also created new challenges and vulnerabilities that would test his leadership skills in the decades to come. As his reputation grew beyond Harlem, he attracted the attention of federal law enforcement agencies less susceptible to local political pressure and community support. At the same time, social and political changes were beginning to transform both the legal and illegal economies in ways that would require new strategies and approaches. The next phase of Bumpy Johnson's career would be defined by his ability to adapt to these changing conditions while maintaining the principles and relationships that had made him successful. The challenges ahead would prove to be the most serious of his career, testing not only his criminal skills, but also his character and his commitment to the community that had made him a legend. The period from 1942 to 1952 would prove to be the most complex and dangerous decade of Bumpy Johnson's criminal career. World War II had transformed American society in ways that created both opportunities and threats for organized crime. War economy had brought unprecedented prosperity to many communities, including Harlem, where defense industry jobs provided steady employment and higher wages than most residents had ever experienced. But the war had also strengthened federal law enforcement agencies and created new forms of international criminal activity that would reshape the underworld for decades to come. For Bumpy, the war years began with an unexpected challenge from within his own organization. Several of his most trusted assistants, influenced by the patriotic fever that swept through Harlem during the early war years, announced they intended to enlist in the military and serve their country overseas. While Bumpy respected their decision and privately admired their courage, Their departure created serious operational problems for his criminal enterprises. The most serious loss was that of James "Big Jim" Parker, who had served as Bumpy's chief enforcer and security coordinator for over 5 years. Parker was a former boxer whose combination of physical intimidation and tactical intelligence had made him invaluable in resolving disputes and protecting Bumpy's operations from interference by competitors and law enforcement. His decision to join the Army left a crucial gap in the organization's leadership structure. Instead of simply replacing Parker with another enforcer, Bumpy used this opportunity to restructure his organization in ways that would make it more resilient and effective. He divided Parker's responsibilities among several different individuals, creating redundancy that would prevent any single person's departure from crippling the organization's operations. More importantly, he began recruiting and training a new generation of leaders who would be prepared to take over key positions when current leaders retired or were arrested or faced other problems. This new generation included several individuals who would play crucial roles in Bumpy's organization for the next 2 decades. Among them was Frank Lucas, the young man from North Carolina whom Bumpy had befriended during his time in Sing Sing. Lucas had been released from prison in 1941 and had quickly proven himself one of the most intelligent and reliable members of Bumpy's organization. Lucas possessed a rare combination of street intelligence and business sophistication that made him ideally suited for leadership in the modern criminal underworld. He understood the importance of maintaining good relationships with customers and community members, but he also recognized the need for careful financial management and strategic planning that would let criminal organizations compete successfully with legal businesses. Under Bumpy's guidance, Lucas developed into a skilled manager who could oversee complex operations while maintaining the security and discipline needed to avoid police interference. He also proved to be an effective negotiator who could resolve disputes with other criminal organizations without resorting to violence that might attract unwanted attention. But the most important addition to Bumpy's organization during this period was a young woman named Helen "Honey" Williams, who became both his romantic partner and his most trusted business advisor. Williams was a college-educated teacher, had become involved in Harlem's underground economy after losing her legal job due to her association with known criminals. Williams brought to the organization skills that had been previously lacking. She was an expert bookkeeper who could keep accurate financial records while ensuring they could not be used as evidence in criminal prosecutions. She was skilled in legal business practices that could be adapted to improve the efficiency of illegal operations. And she had extensive contacts in Harlem's educational and professional communities that provided valuable information about law enforcement activities and political developments. Perhaps most importantly, Williams served as Bumpy's advisor on community relations and public image. She understood his continued success depended on keeping the support and respect of Harlem residents, and she helped him develop more sophisticated approaches to community investment and public relations that strengthened his position as a neighborhood leader. With his organization strengthened and modernized, Bumpy was well positioned to take advantage of the opportunities created by America's entry into World War I. The war had created enormous demand for goods and services that were either rationed or prohibited by government regulations, creating new markets for criminal enterprises that could provide what legal businesses could not. The most profitable of these opportunities involved the black market trade in rationed goods like gasoline, meat, sugar, and consumer products that were in short supply due to wartime production priorities. Bumpy's organization quickly established itself as a major supplier of black market goods throughout Harlem, using the same distribution networks that had been developed for the numbers game and illegal liquor. But the war also created more serious criminal opportunities that would have lasting consequences for Bumpy's career and for organized crime in general. The disruption of international trade and the focus of law enforcement resources on national Security had created unprecedented opportunities for smuggling operations that brought drugs, weapons, and other illegal goods into the United States. The most significant of these opportunities involved heroin, a powerful narcotic that had been primarily manufactured in Europe before the war, but was increasingly being produced in illegal laboratories in Mexico and other Latin American countries. The drug had a relatively small but growing market in American cities, particularly among jazz musicians and other members of the artistic community, who valued its ability to provide temporary escape from the pressures of professional and personal life. Bumpy's initial involvement in heroin trafficking was cautious and limited. He understood drug trafficking carried much greater legal penalties than the gambling and liquor operations that had been the foundation of his criminal empire. He was also concerned about the potential impact on his relationship with the Harlem community, which generally viewed drug dealers with suspicion and hostility. But the profit margins were too attractive to ignore entirely. A kilogram of heroin that could be bought for $1,000 in Mexico could be sold for $20,000 or more in New York, generating profits that dwarfed those available from traditional criminal activities. More importantly, the relatively small quantities involved made drug trafficking easier to hide from law enforcement than the large-scale operations needed for numbers running or bootlegging. Bumpy's entry into drug trafficking was carefully managed to minimize both legal risks and community opposition. He limited his organization's involvement to high-level wholesale operations that supplied smaller dealers, rather than engaging in street-level retail sales that would bring his organization into direct contact with users and their families. He also established strict rules about where drugs could be sold, prohibiting sales near schools, churches, and other community institutions he wanted to protect from the negative consequences of drug activity. Most importantly, he used a significant portion of his drug profits to expand his legal community investments, funding new educational programs, recreational facilities, and business development initiatives that provided positive alternatives to drug involvement for young people in Harlem. But despite these precautions, Bumpy's involvement in drug trafficking created new conflicts and challenges that would dominate the next decade of his career. The most serious of these conflicts arose from competition with Italian-American crime, families that were also expanding their involvement in drug trafficking and saw Bumpy's success as a threat to their own operations. The Italian families had initially been reluctant to become heavily involved in drug trafficking, understanding it carried much greater legal risks than their traditional activities like gambling, loan sharking, and labor racketeering. But the enormous profits available from heroin trafficking eventually overcame their caution. By the late 1940s, several major crime families were actively seeking to control drug distribution throughout New York. Their expansion into drug trafficking brought them into direct competition with Bumpy's organization for the first time since the peace agreement of 1941 had established territorial boundaries that kept them out of Harlem. But drug trafficking was different from other criminal activities because it involved national and international supply chains that could not be neatly divided into local territories. The conflict began in 1948 when members of the Genovese crime family began pressuring some of Bumpy's drug suppliers to sell exclusively to Italian-controlled organizations. The pressure took the form of both financial incentives and physical threats. Several suppliers agreed to switch their loyalties rather than risk violent retaliation. Bumpy's response was swift and decisive. Instead of accepting the loss of his suppliers, he moved to establish direct relationships with drug producers in Mexico and other source countries, bypassing the middlemen who had been pressured by the Italian families. This strategy needed substantial investment in travel, communication, and security, but it gave his organization independence from suppliers who might be vulnerable to pressure from competitors. More importantly, he began developing strategic alliances with black criminal organizations in other cities who were facing similar pressure from Italian crime families. These alliances allowed the sharing of suppliers, transportation networks, and information that made all the participating organizations more effective and more resistant outside interference. The most important of these alliances was with organizations in Detroit, Chicago, and Philadelphia that controlled drug trafficking in their respective cities' black neighborhoods. By coordinating their activities and sharing resources, these organizations were able to create a national network for drug distribution that rivaled those controlled by the traditional Italian-American crime families. But the expansion of drug trafficking also attracted the attention of federal law enforcement agencies that had previously shown little interest in the illegal activities of black criminal organizations. The Federal Bureau of Narcotics, established in 1930 under the leadership of Harry Anslinger, had begun focusing on major drug trafficking organizations as part of a broader federal effort to combat what government officials saw as a growing threat to American society. Unlike local police departments, often susceptible to bribery and political pressure, federal agencies had greater resources, broader jurisdiction, and less vulnerability to the community support that had protected Bumpy from previous law enforcement efforts. Federal agents could conduct surveillance across state lines, use wiretaps and other sophisticated investigative techniques, and prosecute cases in federal courts where judges and juries were less likely to be sympathetic to local criminal leaders. The federal investigation of Bumpy's organization began in 1949 when Bureau of Narcotics agents began tracking international heroin shipments they suspected were being distributed through his network. The investigation was led by Special Agent Charles Siragusa, a skilled investigator who had built his career by successfully prosecuting major drug traffickers throughout the United States. Siragusa understood that building a successful case against Bumpy would need more than just evidence of drug trafficking. It would need proof of his leadership role in a criminal organization and documentation of the financial structure that supported his operations. This meant agents needed to penetrate the security systems Bumpy had developed over 2 decades of criminal activity and gather evidence that would satisfy the strict requirements of federal courts. The investigation proceeded slowly and carefully, with agents using a combination of surveillance, informants, and financial analysis to build a complete picture of Bumpy's criminal empire. They discover his organization was far more sophisticated than they had expected, with elaborate security procedures, multiple layers of management, and financial arrangements that made it difficult to trace money flows or prove individual responsibility for specific criminal acts. More challenging for the federal agents was Bumpy's continued strong support within the Harlem community. Potential informants were reluctant to cooperate with federal authorities, viewing them as outside threats to community stability rather than legitimate law enforcement officers. Surveillance operations were frequently compromised by community members who reported suspicious activities to Bumpy's organization. The investigation was further complicated by Bumpy's legal business activities, which provided plausible explanations for his wealth and his extensive contacts throughout the United States and internationally. His restaurants, real estate investments, and other legal enterprises generated substantial documented income that could account for his lifestyle and financial assets. But the most serious obstacle to the federal investigation was the changing political climate of the early 1950s, which was beginning to focus on different types of criminal threats. The Cold War between the United States and the Soviet Union had created new concerns about national security and communist infiltration that were drawing law enforcement resources away from traditional criminal investigations. Senator Joseph McCarthy's investigations of alleged communist influence in American institutions had created a political atmosphere in which being tough on communism was more important for federal officials than being tough on traditional organized crime. This shift in priorities provided Bumpy with a temporary break from federal pressure. But it also created new challenges as he navigated the complex political currents of the early Cold War era. The political complications of this period were exemplified by Bumpy's relationship with Paul Robeson, the famous singer and actor who had become a prominent advocate for civil rights and social justice causes. Robeson was also a vocal supporter of peaceful coexistence with the Soviet Union and critic of American foreign policy positions that made him a target of government surveillance and harassment. Bumpy's friendship with Robeson, based on mutual respect and shared commitment to improving conditions for Black Americans, brought unwanted attention from federal agencies investigating alleged communist activities in the Black community. FBI agents began including Bumpy in their surveillance of Robeson and other civil rights leaders, not because they suspected him of political subversion, but because his criminal activities might be used to discredit the broader civil rights movement. This political scrutiny created a delicate situation for Bumpy, who needed to maintain his community leadership role while avoiding actions that might provide ammunition for government officials seeking to undermine civil rights activism. He carefully moderated his public statements on political issues, focusing on community development and economic empowerment, rather than more controversial topics like foreign policy or communist ideology. But he also used his influence and resources to support civil rights organizations and leaders facing government harassment. His financial contributions helped fund legal defense efforts for activists who were arrested or prosecuted for their political activities. His organizational skills and community connections assisted in coordinating protests and other political activities that might not have been possible without his support. Perhaps most importantly, his presence as a successful and respected Black leader provided a powerful counter-narrative to government efforts to portray civil rights activism as communist-inspired or un-American. Bumpy's obvious patriotism demonstrated through his support for Black military personnel and defense industry workers during World War II, and his deep roots in the Harlem community made it difficult for critics to dismiss him as an outside agitator or foreign agent. The complex relationship between Bumpy's criminal activities and his community leadership role during this period illustrated the broader contradictions and challenges facing Black Americans in the early Cold War era. On one hand, the post-war economic boom and the beginning of the civil rights movement offered unprecedented opportunities for Black advancement and integration into mainstream American society. On the other hand, systematic discrimination and limited access to legal economic opportunities meant criminal enterprises continued to provide important services and employment in Black communities. Bumpy's ability to navigate these contradictions while maintaining his position as both a successful criminal leader and a respected community figure demonstrated his sophisticated understanding of the political and social dynamics of his era. He recognized his criminal activities, while profitable and important to his community, also created vulnerabilities that could be exploited by opponents of civil rights progress. As a result, he began gradually shifting his focus from expanding his criminal empire toward building legal businesses and community institutions that could provide long-term benefits for Harlem residents. This transition was not a complete abandonment of criminal activity. His organization continued to operate numbers games, secret bars, and other illegal enterprises that remained profitable and popular with community members, but it represented a strategic evolution designed to reduce his legal vulnerabilities while maintaining his community influence and leadership position. The success of this transition strategy would depend on his ability to manage the various conflicts and challenges emerging in the early 1950s. Federal law enforcement pressure was intensifying despite the political distractions of the Cold War. Competition from Italian-American crime families continued to threaten his drug trafficking operations. Most importantly, social and economic changes were beginning to transform Harlem in ways that would require new approaches to both criminal enterprise and community leadership. The stage was set for the most serious challenge of Bumpy Johnson's criminal career, a federal prosecution that would test not only his legal defenses, but also his community support and his ability to maintain his organization during a long period of imprisonment. The outcome of this challenge would determine whether he could successfully complete the transition from criminal leader to legal community figure, or whether the contradictions inherent in his dual role would ultimately destroy the empire he had spent 3 decades building. The year 1952 began ominously for Bumpy Johnson. Federal agents had been building their case against him for over 3 years, and the evidence was finally sufficient to support the kind of major prosecution that could effectively end his criminal career. The investigation had revealed the scope and sophistication of his organization in ways that surprised even experienced law enforcement officials who thought they understood the structure of organized crime in New York. Special Agent Charles Siragusa's investigation had uncovered financial records showing Bumpy's organization had handled over $10 million in illegal transactions during the previous 5 years, an enormous sum that demonstrated the scale of his criminal empire. More damaging were recorded conversations obtained through wiretaps and informants that directly implicated Bumpy in planning and directing drug trafficking operations that violated federal narcotics laws, but the most serious evidence against him came from an unexpected source: Vincent the Chin Gigante, a member of the Genovese crime family who had been arrested on unrelated charges and had agreed to cooperate with federal prosecutors in exchange for a reduced sentence. Gigante's testimony provided detailed information about meetings between Bumpy and Italian-American crime leaders to coordinate drug trafficking activities and divide territorial boundaries. The federal indictment, handed down by a grand jury in Manhattan on March 15, 1952, charged Bumpy with conspiracy to violate federal narcotics laws, a crime that carried a possible sentence of 20 years in federal prison. The charges were based on evidence that his organization had imported, distributed, and sold heroin and other controlled substances in violation of federal law between 1948 and 1952. The indictment sent shockwaves through Harlem, where many residents had never fully understood the extent of Bumpy's involvement in drug trafficking. While his numbers operations and secret bars were widely known and generally accepted as victimless crimes that provided community benefits, drug dealing was viewed much more negatively by residents who had seen the destructive effects of heroin addiction on their families and neighbors. Bumpy's immediate response to the indictment demonstrated the sophisticated legal and political defenses he had built over 2 decades of criminal activity. Within hours of his arrest, he was represented by a team of prominent criminal defense attorneys led by Morris Rothstein, one of New York's most successful defenders of organized crime figures. A bail bondsman who had been retained in advance posted the $100,000 bond that secured his release pending trial. More importantly, Bumpy's political connections immediately mobilized to minimize the damage from the federal charges. Several prominent Harlem leaders, including ministers, businessmen, and elected officials, issued public statements expressing confidence in his character and questioning the motivations behind the federal prosecution. These statements, while carefully worded to avoid endorsing criminal activity, suggested the charges were part of a broader government effort to persecute successful black leaders. The political support was not merely symbolic. Bumpy's extensive financial contributions to legal community organizations and political campaigns had created a network of influential supporters who had strong incentives to protect him from federal prosecution. These supporters worked behind the scenes to pressure federal officials to consider a plea bargain that would let Bumpy avoid the most serious charges in exchange for cooperation with ongoing investigations of other criminal organizations. But federal prosecutors, led by Assistant U.S. Attorney Robert Kennedy, were determined to pursue the case aggressively as part of a broader federal campaign against organized crime. Kennedy, who would later become U.S. Attorney General under his brother, President John F. Kennedy, saw the prosecution of major criminal leaders like Bumpy as essential to demonstrating that federal law enforcement could successfully challenge even the most sophisticated criminal organizations. The prosecution strategy was designed to overcome the community support and political protection that had shielded Bumpy from previous law enforcement efforts. Instead of relying primarily on local police officers and community informants who might be vulnerable to intimidation or bribery, federal prosecutors used evidence gathered through sophisticated investigative techniques difficult to compromise or discredit. The centerpiece of the prosecution case was financial evidence, showing the flow of money through Bumpy's organization in ways that could only be explained by large-scale criminal activity. Bank records, seized documents, and testimony from financial institutions demonstrated his legal businesses could not possibly generate the income necessary to support his lifestyle and investments. Supporting this financial evidence were recorded conversations that demonstrated Bumpy's direct involvement in planning and directing criminal activities. While the conversations were often coded or indirect, federal prosecutors argued they clearly showed his leadership role in a criminal conspiracy that violated federal law. Perhaps most damaging was the testimony of Vincent Gigante and other cooperating witnesses who could provide first-hand accounts of meetings and conversations that established Bumpy's involvement in drug trafficking, while defense attorneys attacked the credibility of these witnesses, arguing they were motivated by their own legal problems to fabricate evidence against Bumpy. Their testimony provided crucial details that corroborated other evidence in the case. Bumpy's defense strategy was based on challenging both the evidence and the motivations behind the federal prosecution. His attorneys argued the financial evidence could be explained by his legal business activities, which had been successful enough to generate substantial income without any involvement in criminal enterprises. They also contended the recorded conversations were taken out of context and did not prove criminal activity beyond a reasonable doubt. More fundamentally, the defense argued Bumpy was being prosecuted because of his prominence as a black community leader rather than because of any serious criminal activity. They pointed to the fact numerous white criminals who engaged in similar activities had not faced federal prosecution, suggesting racial bias was influencing prosecutorial decisions. The trial, which began in October 1952, became one of the most closely watched criminal proceedings in New York history. The courtroom was packed daily with Harlem residents who came to show support for Bumpy, as well as with reporters who recognized the case represented a significant test of federal law enforcement capabilities against sophisticated criminal organizations. The testimony revealed details about the structure and operations of Bumpy's criminal empire that surprised even experienced observers of organized crime. Federal agents described surveillance operations that had documented meetings between Bumpy and criminal leaders from across the United States, demonstrating his influence extended far beyond Harlem. Financial experts explained complex money laundering schemes that had been used to hide the proceeds of criminal activity and make them appear to be legal business income. But the most dramatic testimony came from cooperating witnesses who described specific criminal activities in which they had participated under Bumpy's direction. Vincent Gigante provided detailed accounts of meetings in which Bumpy had negotiated territorial agreements with Italian-American crime families and had coordinated the importation and distribution of large quantities of heroin. Other witnesses described the internal structure of Bumpy's organization, including the elaborate security procedures that had been used to protect against law enforcement infiltration and the strict discipline that had been maintained among members of the criminal conspiracy. Their testimony painted a picture of a sophisticated criminal enterprise that operated with the efficiency and organization of a legal corporation. The defense response was vigorous but ultimately unsuccessful. Bumpy's attorneys were able to raise questions about the credibility and motivations of some prosecution witnesses, and they presented evidence of his legal community activities that suggested he was a respectable businessman. rather than a criminal leader. But they were unable to provide convincing alternative explanations for the extensive evidence of criminal activity that had been gathered through the federal investigation. On December 18, 1952, after deliberating for 3 days, the jury returned guilty verdicts on all major charges against Bumpy Johnson. The evidence of his involvement in a criminal conspiracy to violate federal narcotics laws had been overwhelming. Despite the vigorous defense effort and the substantial community support he had received throughout the trial, the sentencing hearing, held 2 weeks later, provided Bumpy with his final opportunity to address the court and the community before beginning what would likely be a long period of imprisonment. His statement, delivered without notes, but with the eloquence that had made him a respected community leader, acknowledged his criminal activities while defending his contributions to the Harlem community. "Your Honor," he began, "I stand before you today as a man who has made mistakes, but also as a man who has tried to serve his community in the best way he knew how. I do not ask for sympathy or special treatment, but I do ask that you consider the full measure of my life and not just the charges that have brought me to this courtroom." He went on to describe his community investments and charitable activities, his support for civil rights organizations, and his efforts to provide economic opportunities for residents of a neighborhood that had been systematically excluded from legal economic development, while acknowledging some of his methods had violated federal law. He argued his motivations had been to benefit his community, rather than simply to enrich himself. The statement was eloquent and moving, but it did not significantly influence the sentencing decision. Judge Irving Kaufman, who had presided over the trial, imposed a sentence of 11 years in federal prison to be served at the maximum security United States Penitentiary at Alcatraz Island in California. The sentence reflected both the seriousness of the crimes and the judge's determination to send a message that even the most sophisticated and community-supported criminal leaders could not escape the consequences of violating federal law. As Bumpy was led away in handcuffs to begin his journey to federal prison, few observers could have predicted this setback would ultimately strengthen rather than destroy his position as a leader in both the criminal underworld and the legal community. His imprisonment at Alcatraz would provide him with opportunities to build relationships with other major criminal leaders, to refine his understanding of criminal organization and strategy, and to plan for a return to Harlem that would establish him as an even more powerful and influential figure than he had been before his arrest. But first, he would have to survive 11 years in the most notorious and secure prison in America, surrounded by the most dangerous and sophisticated criminals in the federal system. The lessons he would learn and the relationships he would build during this period of imprisonment would shape the final chapter of his criminal career and establish the foundation for his emergence as a legendary figure whose influence would extend far beyond the world of organized crime. The ferry that carried Ellsworth, Bumpy Johnson across San Francisco Bay to Alcatraz Island on a foggy morning in January 1953 was transporting him to what many considered the end of the line for American criminals. The Rock, as inmates called it, was designed to hold the federal prison system's most dangerous and hard to control offenders, men who had proven they could not be safely confined in conventional prisons. But for Bumpy, Alcatraz represented an opportunity as much as a punishment. The prison's population included many of the most successful and sophisticated criminals in America, men whose knowledge and experience could provide valuable education for someone intelligent enough to listen and learn. More importantly, the prison's reputation for security meant relationships formed there were built on respect and mutual interest rather than the temporary alliances of convenience that characterized most criminal associations. Initial weeks of imprisonment were a difficult adjustment for a man who had spent the previous 2 decades as the undisputed leader of his own criminal empire. The rigid routine of prison life, the constant surveillance by guards, and the loss of privacy and autonomy were psychological challenges that tested even his considerable mental discipline and resilience. But Bumpy adapted to prison life with the same strategic intelligence that had made him successful on the streets of Harlem. He quickly established himself as a leader among the prison population, not through violence or intimidation, but through the demonstration of character traits respected even in the brutal environment of maximum security confinement. His reputation for honesty and fair dealing, established over 2 decades of criminal activity, proved to be valuable assets in prison. Inmates who might have been suspicious of a new arrival quickly recognized Bumpy could be trusted to keep his word, to mediate disputes fairly, and to honor the complex system of debts and obligations that governed prison relationships. More importantly, his intellectual interests and sophisticated understanding of criminal organization made him a valuable advisor and mentor to other inmates planning their own return to criminal activity after their release. His cell became an informal classroom where younger criminals could learn about strategic planning, organizational management, and the political and social dynamics that determine success or failure in the criminal underworld. Among the inmates who sought Bumpy's guidance was Alvin "Creepy" Karpis, a former leader of the Barker Karpis gang, who had been one of the FBI's most wanted fugitives during the 1930s. Karpis was nearing the end of a long sentence for kidnapping and bank robbery, and he was eager to learn about the changes that had occurred in organized crime during his imprisonment. From Karpis, Bumpy learned about the sophisticated techniques used by the most successful bank robbers of the Depression era, including methods of surveillance, escape planning, and managing criminal partnerships that could be adapted to other forms of criminal enterprise. More importantly, Karpis provided insights into the psychology and tactics of federal law enforcement that proved invaluable in understanding how to avoid future prosecutions. Another important relationship was with Mickey Cohen, a Los Angeles-based gangster who had controlled much of that city's illegal gambling and vice operations during the 1940s. Cohen's experience with the movie industry and his relationships with Hollywood celebrities provided Bumpy with valuable insights into the entertainment business and its potential for criminal exploitation. But perhaps the most significant relationship Bumpy formed during his imprisonment was with Robert Stroud, the famous Birdman of Alcatraz, who had become an internationally recognized expert on ornithology during his decades of solitary confinement. Stroud's story of a violent criminal who had transformed himself into a respected scientist through self-education and disciplined study provided inspiration and guidance for Bumpy's own intellectual development. Under Stroud's influence, Bumpy began a systematic program of education that went far beyond the criminal knowledge he gained from other inmates. He read extensively in history, philosophy, economics, and political science, developing a sophisticated understanding of social and economic systems that would prove crucial to his later success. He was particularly influenced by the writings of Marcus Garvey, whose philosophy of black nationalism and economic independence resonated with his own experiences as a criminal leader who had refused to accept subordination to white criminal organizations. Garvey's emphasis on the importance of economic development and community organization provided a theoretical framework for the community leadership role Bumpy had developed during his years in Harlem, but he also studied the works of mainstream economists and political theorists. seeking to understand the larger social and economic forces that shaped both legal and illegal markets. His reading of Adam Smith, John Maynard Keynes, and other economic thinkers provided insights into market dynamics, competition, and regulation that could be applied to criminal enterprises as well as legal businesses. Perhaps most importantly, he developed a sophisticated understanding of political power and its relationship to criminal activity. His study of political history and theory helped him recognize successful criminal organizations needed to understand and work within existing political systems rather than simply trying to operate outside them. This intellectual development was complemented by physical conditioning that maintained his health and strength despite the limitations of prison life. He developed a rigorous exercise routine that included both conventional physical training and martial arts techniques learned from other inmates who had military or law enforcement backgrounds. The combination of intellectual and physical development made Bumpy one of the most respected and influential inmates at Alcatraz. His cell became a gathering place for serious discussions about criminal strategy, political developments, and philosophical questions that went far beyond the typical concerns of prison life. But his influence extended beyond informal education and mentorship. He became involved in prison politics, serving as an unofficial mediator for disputes between different racial and ethnic groups among the inmate population. His reputation for fairness and his sophisticated understanding of human psychology made him effective in resolving conflicts that might otherwise have resulted in violence. These mediation efforts were not simply altruistic. They served important strategic purposes for Bumpy's own prison survival and his plans for post-release activities. By establishing himself as a respected neutral figure, he built relationships with criminals from different organizations and different parts of the country that would prove valuable when he returned to active criminal leadership. The relationships he developed during his imprisonment included Italian-American crime family members, Irish and Jewish gangsters from various East Coast cities, and black criminals from throughout the United States who shared his vision of independent criminal organizations that could compete successfully with traditional white-dominated crime families. But perhaps the most important aspect of his Alcatraz experience was the opportunity it provided for long-term strategic planning. Freed from the day-to-day pressures of managing an active criminal organization, Bumpy could think carefully about the changes occurring in both the criminal underworld and the legal society that surrounded it. He recognized the civil rights movement was beginning to transform American society in ways that would create both opportunities and challenges for black criminal leaders. On one hand, the breakdown of rigid racial segregation would provide greater access to legal economic opportunities that might reduce the demand for criminal services. On the other hand, the political mobilization of black communities would create new possibilities for criminal organizations that could align themselves with community development and civil rights goals. He also understood law enforcement was becoming more sophisticated and better coordinated, making it necessary for criminal organizations to develop new methods of operation that could avoid detection and prosecution. The federal investigation that had led to his imprisonment had demonstrated the importance of operational security, financial management, and political protection in ways that would require fundamental changes in how criminal enterprises were organized and managed. Most importantly, he recognized the drug trafficking that had brought him to federal prison was likely to become an increasingly important part of the criminal economy. Despite its negative effects on the communities where it operated, the profit margins were simply too attractive for criminal organizations to ignore. But successful involvement would require much more sophisticated approaches to minimize both legal risks and community opposition. By the late 1950s, Bumpy had developed a comprehensive strategy for his return to criminal leadership that addressed all these challenges while building on the relationships and knowledge he had gained during his imprisonment. The strategy emphasized community development and civil rights activism as covers for criminal activity, sophisticated operational security to avoid law enforcement detection, and strategic alliances with criminal organizations throughout the United States to share risks and resources. But first, he would need to serve the remainder of his sentence while maintaining the relationships and reputation essential to implementing his post-release plans. The final years of his imprisonment would test his patience and discipline as he watched from a distance while dramatic changes transformed both Harlem and the broader American society to which he would eventually return. The man who would walk out of Alcatraz in 1963 would be fundamentally different from the criminal leader who had entered federal prison 11 years earlier. He would be older, wiser, and more sophisticated in his understanding of both criminal enterprise and community leadership. Most importantly, he would be ready to implement a vision of criminal organization that could adapt to the changing social and political conditions of the 1960s while maintaining the community support and respect that had made him a legendary figure in Harlem. The Harlem that greeted Bumpy Johnson upon his release from Alcatraz on March 8, 1963, was a neighborhood transformed. That 11 years of social, political, and economic change had reshaped the community in ways that would challenge everything he thought he knew about criminal leadership and community power. The civil rights movement was reaching its peak, with mass demonstrations and political organizing transforming the relationship between Black Americans and the broader society. But beneath the surface optimism of the movement lay deeper problems that would create both opportunities and dangers for a returning criminal leader. The most obvious change was physical. Urban renewal projects had demolished many of the tenements and small businesses that had defined Harlem's streetscape during Bumpy's heyday. In their place rose housing projects and government buildings that reflected a different vision of community development, one that emphasized centralized planning and social services, rather than the organic network of small businesses and informal institutions that had previously sustained neighborhood life. Many of the people Bumpy had known were gone. Some had died, others had moved away in search of better opportunities, and still others had been incarcerated or had simply disappeared into the anonymity of a changing city. The tight-knit community networks that had provided both customers and protection for his criminal enterprises had been disrupted by demographic change and social mobility. But perhaps the most significant change was political. The civil rights movement had created new forms of Black leadership that challenged traditional power structures in ways that affected both legal and illegal institutions. Ministers, lawyers, and political activists had emerged as influential community voices, often explicitly rejecting the kind of criminal leadership Bumpy represented. At the same time, the movement had created new opportunities for Black political participation and economic development that reduced some of the community needs criminal organizations had traditionally served. Government programs provided social services that had previously been available only through informal community networks. Civil rights legislation opened access to jobs, housing, and business opportunities that had been denied during the era of rigid racial segregation. Bumpy's initial response to these changes demonstrated the strategic intelligence that had made him successful during his earlier career. Instead of attempting to immediately re-establish his former criminal empire, he spent his first months of freedom carefully studying the new landscape and identifying opportunities that matched the changed conditions. He began by reconnecting with old associates who had remained in Harlem during his imprisonment, learning about the developments and changes that had occurred during his absence. Many of his former assistants had established their own independent operations, some legal and others criminal, that had filled the vacuum created by his imprisonment. More importantly, he began building relationships with the new generation of community leaders who had emerged during the civil rights era. These relationships were delicate and complex, requiring careful navigation of the tensions between criminal activity and political activism that characterized the changing dynamics of community power. His approach was typically sophisticated. Instead of presenting himself as a criminal leader seeking to re-establish his former empire, he positioned himself as a successful businessman and community elder who had paid his debt to society and was ready to contribute to the positive development of his neighborhood. His legal businesses, which had been managed by trusted associates during his imprisonment, provided credible evidence of his transformation and commitment to legal activity. But he also understood complete abandonment of criminal activity would eliminate his ability to influence community affairs and protect his interests against potential threats. The challenge was to develop a new model of criminal leadership that could operate effectively within the changed political and social environment of the 1960s. The solution he developed was characteristically innovative. Instead of attempting to control large-scale criminal enterprises like the numbers game or drug trafficking, he positioned himself as a facilitator and mediator who could resolve disputes and coordinate activities between different criminal organizations while maintaining enough distance to avoid direct legal liability. This approach let him maintain influence and generate income from criminal activities without the operational exposure that had led to his federal prosecution. It also enabled him to present himself to the legal community as a reformed criminal, using his knowledge and connections to prevent violence and reduce the negative effects of illegal activities on community life. The effectiveness of this strategy was demonstrated by his involvement in resolving a potentially destructive conflict between different factions involved in Harlem's drug trade. During his imprisonment, heroin trafficking had expanded dramatically, creating competition between different organizations that threatened to erupt into violence that would have attracted intensive law enforcement attention and disrupted legal community activities. Working behind the scenes, Bumpy negotiated agreements between the competing factions that established territorial boundaries and operational procedures that minimized conflicts, while letting all parties operate profitably. His success in preventing violence while maintaining order in the drug trade enhanced his reputation among both criminals and legal community leaders who recognized the value of his intervention. But his most important early success involved establishing a relationship with Malcolm X, the charismatic minister and civil rights leader who had become one of the most influential voices in the black community. Malcolm's philosophy of black nationalism and economic independence resonated with themes Bumpy had developed during his own career, creating the foundation for a complex but ultimately productive relationship. Malcolm X understood community development needed the involvement of all segments of the black population, including those who had been involved in criminal activities but were ready to contribute to legal progress. He also recognized Bumpy's knowledge, connections, and resources could be valuable assets in the struggle for civil rights and economic justice. For Bumpy, the relationship with Malcolm X provided an opportunity to align his activities with the broader social and political movements transforming American society. By supporting civil rights activities and community development projects, he could enhance his reputation as a community leader while building the political protection that had always been essential to successful criminal enterprise. The relationship between the two men was built on mutual respect and shared commitment to black community development, but it also involved practical considerations that benefited both parties. Malcolm's political activities provided cover and legitimacy for some of Bumpy's business operations, while Bumpy's resources and connections helped support Malcolm's organizing efforts and protected him from threats by hostile groups. But the most significant aspect of their relationship was intellectual. Both men were sophisticated thinkers who understood the complex relationships between race, power, and economic development in American society. Their conversations and collaboration contributed to the development of ideas about black nationalism and community control that would influence political movements for decades to come. The partnership with Malcolm X also provided Bumpy with valuable insights into the changing dynamics of federal law enforcement, which had become increasingly focused on civil rights issues and political surveillance rather than traditional criminal activities. Malcolm's experience with FBI monitoring and harassment helped Bumpy understand how to operate in an environment where political and criminal activities were subject to intensive government scrutiny. But their relationship also created new vulnerabilities and dangers that would ultimately contribute to the tragic events of the mid-1960s. Malcolm's growing influence and increasingly radical political positions made him a target for violence by both racist organizations and rival factions within the civil rights movement. His association with Bumpy provided ammunition for critics who sought to discredit his political activities by linking them to criminal enterprise. More dangerously, the relationship attracted the attention of federal agencies monitoring both civil rights leaders and organized crime figures as part of broader domestic surveillance programs. The FBI's COINTELPRO operations, designed to disrupt and destroy black political organizations, included efforts to exploit connections between legal political leaders and criminal figures to undermine community support for civil rights activities. Despite these risks, the partnership between Bumpy Johnson and Malcolm X represented one of the most interesting and productive collaborations in the history of American criminal enterprise and political activism. Both men understood their individual success depended on the broader health and development of the black community, and both were willing to work across traditional boundaries to achieve their shared goals. The success of this approach was demonstrated by Bumpy's rapid emergence as one of the most influential figures in 1960s Harlem. Despite his recent return from a long federal prison sentence, his combination of criminal connections, legal business interests, and political relationships gave him a unique position in community affairs, recognized by leaders across the spectrum of legal and illegal activities. But this success also set the stage for the conflicts and challenges that would define his final years of criminal leadership. His growing influence attracted the attention of competitors who wanted to share in his success and law enforcement agencies that recognized him as a significant threat to their efforts to control organized crime. Most importantly, the rapid social and political changes of the 1960s would create new forms of violence and instability that would test his leadership skills and ultimately contribute to the dramatic conclusion of his remarkable career. The relationship between Bumpy Johnson and Malcolm X began in the spring of 1963, just weeks after Bumpy's return from Alcatraz, and would become one of the most significant and complex partnerships in the history of both organized crime and the civil rights movement. Their first meeting took place at a small restaurant on Lenox Avenue, arranged by mutual friends who believed both men could benefit from the knowledge and resources the other possessed. Malcolm Little, who had taken the surname X to represent the African name stolen by slavery, was at the height of his influence as the most prominent spokesperson for the Nation of Islam and one of the most compelling voices in the struggle for black liberation. His combination of intellectual brilliance, moral authority, and charismatic speaking ability had made him a national figure whose influence extended far beyond the religious organization he represented. But Malcolm also faced significant challenges that made Bumpy's friendship and support valuable. His increasingly radical positions had brought him into conflict with other civil rights leaders who favored more moderate approaches to achieving racial equality. His criticism of white liberalism and his advocacy of black nationalism had made him a target for government surveillance and harassment. Most importantly, his growing independence from Nation of Islam doctrine was creating tensions with the organization's leadership that would eventually lead to his departure, and the threats against his life that would culminate in his assassination. For Bumpy, The relationship with Malcolm offered opportunities that went beyond mere political cover for his criminal activities. Malcolm's intellectual sophistication and political vision provided insights into the social and economic changes, transforming American society in ways that would affect both legal and illegal enterprises. His extensive network of contacts throughout the black community and his relationships with international political figures provided access to information and opportunities valuable for both business and political purposes. More fundamentally, Malcolm's philosophy of black nationalism and economic independence resonated with themes Bumpy had developed throughout his own career. Both men believed black communities needed to develop their own institutions and economic base rather than depending on the charity or goodwill of white society. Both understood political power ultimately derived from economic strength and organizational capacity rather than moral appeals to justice and equality. Their first substantial collaboration involved Malcolm's efforts to establish economic development programs that would provide alternatives to welfare dependency and menial employment for Harlem residents. Malcolm's political philosophy emphasized the importance of black-owned businesses and financial institutions that could provide jobs and services within the community while building wealth that remained under black control. But implementing these ideas needed capital, business expertise, and political connections the Nation of Islam and other civil rights organizations often lacked. Malcolm recognized Bumpy's success in building and managing complex business operations, even illegal ones, represented valuable knowledge that could be adapted to legal enterprises. More practically, Bumpy's financial resources and network of business contacts could provide crucial support for economic development projects that might otherwise fail due to lack of funding or expertise. The partnership began with small projects that tested the compatibility of their approaches and the effectiveness of their collaboration. Bumpy provided financial backing and business advice for several small retail establishments. Malcolm helped organize as examples of successful black entrepreneurship. These businesses, grocery stores, restaurants, and service shops, were run entirely by black owners and employees, providing both jobs and services that kept money circulating within the Harlem community. The success of these initial ventures led to more ambitious projects, including a community development corporation that purchased and rehabilitated deteriorating housing stock to provide quality, affordable housing for working families. This project combined Malcolm's political vision with Bumpy's practical knowledge of real estate investment and property management, creating a model that would later be adopted by other community development organizations throughout the country. But perhaps the most significant aspect of their collaboration was intellectual. Both men were voracious readers and sophisticated thinkers who enjoyed exploring the complex relationships between race, power, and economic development in American society. Their conversations, often conducted during long walks through Harlem or late-night discussions in Bumpy's restaurant, contributed to the development of ideas that would influence black political thought for decades to come. Malcolm's exposure to Bumpy's experiences in managing large-scale, illegal enterprises provided him with insights into organizational structure and strategic planning that enhanced his effectiveness as a political leader. Bumpy's understanding of how to build loyalty, maintain discipline, and coordinate complex operations proved applicable to the challenges of organizing mass political movements and maintaining unity among diverse groups with different interests and priorities. Conversely, Bumpy's exposure to Malcolm's international perspective and his connections with liberation movements in Africa and Asia broadened his understanding of the global context within which American racial struggles were occurring. Malcolm's trips to Africa and the Middle East had given him sophisticated insights into international politics and economics that helped Bumpy understand how global developments might create opportunities for Black American advancement. Their collaboration was particularly evident in their shared approach to the problem of drug addiction, which was devastating many Harlem families and undermining community stability. Both men understood. Simply condemning drug use or demanding stricter law enforcement would not solve the underlying social and economic problems that made drugs attractive to many young people. Instead, they developed a comprehensive approach that combined Malcolm's political organizing with Bumpy's practical knowledge of how drug trafficking operations actually functioned. Malcolm organized community education programs that explained the economic and social dynamics of the drug trade, helping residents understand how drug addiction weakened their community, while enriching outsiders who had no concern for black welfare. Bumpy complemented these educational efforts by using his influence with drug dealers to establish restrictions on where and how drugs could be sold. He negotiated agreements that kept drug sales away from schools, churches, and other community institutions while encouraging dealers to avoid marketing to children and to provide information about treatment programs to customers who wanted help overcoming addiction. This approach was controversial within both the civil rights movement and the criminal underworld, but it proved effective in reducing some of the most destructive aspects of drug trafficking while acknowledging the reality that drugs would continue to be available regardless of legal or moral prohibitions. The partnership between Bumpy and Malcolm also involved mutual protection against the various threats both men faced due to their prominence and influence. Malcolm's growing independence from Nation of Islam doctrine had created tensions with the organization's leadership, particularly Elijah Muhammad, who viewed Malcolm's intellectual development and international connections as threats to his own authority. These tensions were worsened by Malcolm's discovery of Elijah Muhammad's personal conduct, which contradicted the moral teachings of the Nation of Islam and undermined Malcolm's faith in the organization's leadership. As Malcolm began to distance himself from the Nation of Islam and develop his own religious and political philosophy, he faced increasing threats of violence from members who viewed his departure as betrayal. Bumpy's protection was both practical and a deterrent. His reputation for intelligence and ruthlessness made potential attackers think carefully about the consequences of harming someone under his protection. More importantly, his extensive network of informants and contacts throughout Harlem's underworld provided early warning of threats and plots that might otherwise have caught Malcolm by surprise. But the most significant aspect of Bumpy's protection was his ability to negotiate with different factions and organizations that might have reasons to target Malcolm. His reputation for fairness and his position as a neutral figure in many disputes made him effective in mediating conflicts before they escalated to violence. The effectiveness of this protection was demonstrated during the period leading up to Malcolm's departure from the Nation of Islam in March 1964. Death threats against Malcolm had increased dramatically as his conflicts with the organization's leadership became public, and several attempts were made to attack him in public appearances and at his home. Bumpy's intervention prevented several of these attacks through a combination of negotiation, intimidation, and strategic intervention that demonstrated his sophisticated understanding of the complex dynamics involved in political and personal conflicts. His efforts may have extended Malcolm's life by months, providing time for the development of ideas and relationships that would have lasting influence on the civil rights movement. But the protection also created vulnerabilities for both men that would ultimately contribute to the tragic events of 1965. The association between a prominent civil rights leader and a known criminal figure provided ammunition for critics who sought to discredit Malcolm's political message by linking it to illegal activities. FBI surveillance of both men increased dramatically as federal agents sought to exploit their relationship for intelligence purposes and to identify potential pressure points that could be used to undermine their activities. More dangerously, the partnership attracted the attention of rival criminal organizations and law enforcement agencies that saw opportunities to weaken both men by exploiting their association. Criminal competitors threatened by Bumpy's growing influence could attack him indirectly by targeting Malcolm, while law enforcement officials who wanted to prosecute Bumpy could use his association with the political figure to justify more intensive surveillance and investigation. The complex dynamics of their relationship were further complicated by the rapid changes occurring in both the civil rights movement and the criminal underworld during the mid-1960s, the passage of major civil rights legislation, and the increasing militancy of younger activists were creating new forms of political organization that challenged traditional leadership structures. At the same time, the expansion of drug trafficking and the increasing sophistication of law enforcement were transforming the criminal landscape in ways that required new strategies and approaches. Both men understood their partnership was occurring during a period of historical transition that would determine the future direction of both black political movements and criminal organizations. Their collaboration represented an attempt to bridge the gap between legal political activism and the underground economy in ways that could strengthen black communities while advancing both civil rights and economic development. The success of this effort was demonstrated by the growth of Malcolm's influence and the expansion of Bumpy's legal business interests during the period of their collaboration. Malcolm's speeches and writings during this period showed increasing sophistication in understanding economic and political dynamics, while Bumpy's community investments and political activities demonstrated a level of civic engagement that went far beyond mere cover for criminal enterprise. But their partnership was ultimately limited by the inherent tensions between criminal activity and political leadership, as well as by the external pressures created by government surveillance and the hostility of various organizations that felt threatened by their growing influence. The assassination of Malcolm X on February 21, 1965, at the Audubon Ballroom in Harlem marked the end of one of the most remarkable partnerships in American history and the beginning of the final phase of Bumpy Johnson's career as a criminal leader and community figure. The loss of his friend and collaborator was both a personal tragedy and a strategic setback that would influence his decisions and activities during his remaining years. The assassination of Malcolm X in February 1965 marked a turning point, not only in the civil rights movement, but also in the criminal landscape of New York City. The loss of his most important political ally and the increased federal scrutiny that followed Malcolm's death forced Bumpy Johnson to reassess his position and develop new strategies for maintaining his influence in a rapidly changing environment. The most immediate challenge came from the Italian-American crime families who had been watching Bumpy's growing influence with increasing concern. His partnership with Malcolm X and his success in building bridges between criminal enterprises and legal political movements had demonstrated a level of sophistication and community support that threatened the traditional power structure of organized crime in New York. The Italian families had initially been content to let Bumpy operate independently in Harlem, recognizing his control of black neighborhoods served their interests by maintaining order and preventing the kind of random violence that might attract unwanted law enforcement attention. But his expansion beyond traditional criminal activities into political influence and community development represented a challenge to their assumption that black criminals could be contained within limited geographical and economic boundaries. The conflict began in earnest during the summer of 1965 when representatives of the Genovese crime family approached several of Bumpy's business partners with offers to provide protection for their operations in exchange for monthly tribute payments. The approach was presented as a routine business proposition, but Bumpy understood it represented the first step in a systematic effort to bring his entire organization under Italian control. His response was characteristically subtle and strategic. Instead of rejecting the Italian demands outright, which would have precipitated immediate conflict, he entered into negotiations designed to clarify the exact nature of the relationship the Italian families were seeking to establish. These negotiations revealed the Italians were not simply interested in tribute payments. They wanted to restructure Harlem's entire criminal economy under their direct supervision. The Italian proposal involved centralizing control of all major criminal activities in Harlem under a single organization that would report to the established crime families. This would have eliminated the independence Bumpy had maintained throughout his career and reduced him to the status of a middle manager in someone else's criminal empire. More significantly, the proposal would have ended Bumpy's role as a community leader and political figure, since the Italian families had no interest in the kind of community, investments and political activities that had been central to his approach to criminal leadership. They viewed these activities as unnecessary expenses that reduced profits without providing equivalent benefits to the criminal organization. Bumpy's rejection of the Italian proposal was delivered through intermediaries in language that was diplomatic but unambiguous. He expressed respect for the established crime families and acknowledged their historical importance in New York's criminal hierarchy, but he made it clear Harlem would continue to operate under local control and his organization would maintain its independence regardless of outside pressure. The Italian response was swift and predictable. Within days of his rejection of their proposal, several of Bumpy's businesses were vandalized, and 2 of his associates were beaten by unknown assailants. The message was clear: submit to Italian control or face escalating violence that would eventually force compliance or eliminate his organization entirely. But Bumpy had been preparing for this confrontation since his return from Alcatraz, and his response demonstrated the sophisticated strategic thinking that had made him successful throughout his career. Instead of engaging in a direct military confrontation that would favor the Italians' superior numbers and resources, he developed an asymmetric strategy designed to make Italian expansion into Harlem too expensive and dangerous to sustain. The strategy was based on 3 key elements: intelligence, alliances, and targeted disruption. His extensive network of informants throughout New York's criminal underworld provided advanced warning of Italian plans and operations, letting him anticipate and counter their moves before they could achieve their objectives. More importantly, he activated strategic alliances he had been building since his return from prison with other independent criminal organizations threatened by Italian expansion. These alliances included black criminal leaders in other cities, Jewish and Irish gangsters who had maintained their independence from Italian control, and even some Italian Americans dissatisfied with the rigid hierarchy and limited opportunities available within the traditional crime families. The alliance strategy was particularly effective because it transformed what the Italian families had expected to be a localized conflict in Harlem into a multi-front war that stretched their resources and divided their attention. When they moved against Bumpy's operations in Harlem, they found themselves facing coordinated retaliation against their own businesses throughout New York and other cities where alliance members operated. The targeted disruption component of the strategy involved systematic attacks on Italian-controlled businesses and operations designed to demonstrate their vulnerability, while avoiding the kind of spectacular violence that would attract intensive law enforcement attention. Instead of engaging in gun battles or assassinations that would generate media coverage and police investigations, Bumpy's forces conducted precise operations that damaged Italian interests while maintaining plausible deniability. These operations included the systematic harassment of Italian-controlled gambling operations, the disruption of their loan sharking and protection rackets, and the recruitment of key personnel who were offered better terms for switching their allegiances. The cumulative effect was to make Italian operations in black neighborhoods unprofitable and dangerous while demonstrating Bumpy's organization remained capable of effective resistance. The effectiveness of this strategy was enhanced by Bumpy's continued strong support within the Harlem community, which viewed the Italian expansion efforts as an attempt by outside forces to exploit and control their neighborhood. Community members provided intelligence about Italian activities, refused to cooperate with their business operations, and actively supported Bumpy's resistance efforts in ways that made Italian operations extremely difficult to sustain. The conflict reached its climax in the fall of 1966 when the Italian families made a serious attempt to eliminate Bumpy personally through a coordinated assassination plot involving multiple gunmen and elaborate planning. The attempt failed due to advanced warning provided by Bumpy's intelligence network, but it demonstrated the Italians were prepared to escalate the conflict to the highest levels of violence. Bumpy's response to the assassination attempt was decisive and final. Instead of simply retaliating against the gunmen sent to kill him, he targeted the Italian leaders who had ordered the attack, using methods that were both more subtle and more permanent than conventional criminal violence. The details of his retaliation were never fully revealed. But within 6 months, several key figures in the Italian families had either died under suspicious circumstances, been arrested on serious federal charges, or had simply disappeared from their usual activities. The message was unmistakable. Attempts to eliminate Bumpy Johnson would result in consequences that extended far beyond the immediate participants. More importantly, the failed assassination attempt provided Bumpy with the justification he needed to abandon the restraint that had previously characterized his approach to conflict with the Italian families. His retaliation was so effective and so precisely targeted, convinced the Italian leadership continued conflict with his organization was not worth the costs involved. The resolution of the conflict came through a series of negotiations conducted during the winter of 1966-67, mediated by neutral figures respected by both sides. The agreement that emerged preserved Bumpy's independence while acknowledging the Italian family's broader authority over organized crime in New York. Under the terms of the agreement, Bumpy retained complete control over criminal activities in Harlem and other black neighborhoods, while agreeing to coordinate with Italian organizations on matters that affected their mutual interests. The Italians withdrew their demands for tribute or direct control, while Bumpy agreed to limit his expansion into areas traditionally controlled by the established crime families. More importantly, the agreement established procedures for resolving future disputes through negotiation rather than violence, and it recognized Bumpy's status as an equal partner in the loose confederation of criminal organizations that controlled illegal activities throughout New York. The successful resolution of the Italian problem represented the culmination of Bumpy Johnson's career as a strategic leader in organized crime. He had demonstrated the ability to resist pressure from the most powerful criminal organizations in America while maintaining his independence and community support. More importantly, he had established a model for black criminal leadership that combined traditional criminal activities with community development and political involvement in ways that served multiple purposes simultaneously. But the victory also came at a significant cost. The prolonged conflict had consumed enormous resources and energy that might otherwise have been devoted to building legal businesses and community institutions. The violence and tension associated with the conflict had disrupted some of the positive community development work that had been central to Bumpy's approach to criminal leadership. Most importantly, the high-profile nature of the conflict had attracted intensive federal law enforcement attention that would make it increasingly difficult for Bumpy to operate with the relative freedom that had characterized his earlier career. FBI agents and federal prosecutors who had been monitoring his activities with routine interest were now focused on building cases that could result in serious criminal charges. The stage was set for the final phase of Bumpy Johnson's remarkable career, a period that would test his ability to maintain his criminal empire while adapting to changing social conditions and increasing law enforcement pressure. The challenges ahead would prove to be among the most serious of his entire career, and their resolution would determine his ultimate legacy as both a criminal leader and a community figure. The period from 1967 to 1968 marked the beginning of the beginning of what would prove to be the final chapter of Bumpy Johnson's extraordinary life. At 62, he remained one of the most powerful and respected figures in Harlem. But the accumulated pressures of nearly 4 decades of criminal leadership were beginning to take their toll on both his health and his organization. The successful resolution of his conflict with the Italian crime families had established his reputation as one of the most skilled strategic thinkers in organized crime. But it had also attracted the kind of federal attention that had previously focused primarily on Italian-American criminal organizations. The FBI's Organized Crime Task Force, led by agents who had cut their teeth investigating traditional mafia families, was now turning its sophisticated surveillance and investigation techniques toward black criminal leaders who had achieved similar levels of power and influence. The federal investigation that would eventually lead to new charges against Bumpy began in earnest during the spring of 1967, when agents began systematically documenting his activities using wiretaps, financial analysis, and informants recruited from within his organization. The investigation was more sophisticated and comprehensive than anything he had previously faced, reflecting both advances in law enforcement technology and the increased resources federal agencies were devoting to organized crime prosecutions. But the most serious challenge to Bumpy's continued leadership came not from external law enforcement pressure, but from changes within his own organization and the broader criminal landscape that had supported his success for so many years. Many of his most trusted assistants were aging and facing their own health problems, while the younger criminals who might have replaced them were attracted to different forms of illegal enterprise that required different skills and operated according to different principles. The drug trade, which had been a relatively small part of Bumpy's criminal empire during his earlier career, was expanding rapidly and attracting a new generation of criminals, less interested in community relationships and political influence than in maximizing profits through efficient distribution networks. These younger criminals viewed Bumpy's emphasis on community investment and political involvement as outdated approaches that reduced profits without providing equivalent benefits. More troubling was the increasing violence associated with drug trafficking, which threatened the community support that had always been essential to Bumpy's success. The heroin epidemic devastating many urban communities during the late 1960s was creating social problems that could not be addressed through the kind of community mediation and informal social control that had characterized Bumpy's approach to criminal leadership. Families who had lost children to drug addiction were less likely to view criminal leaders as community protectors, regardless of their other contributions to neighborhood life, religious and political. Leaders who had previously been willing to work with Bumpy on community development projects were increasingly reluctant to associate with anyone connected to drug trafficking, even indirectly. Bumpy's response to these challenges demonstrated both his continued strategic intelligence and his recognition that the criminal landscape was changing in ways that might require fundamental adjustments to his approach. He began gradually reducing his organization's involvement in drug trafficking, while expanding his legal business activities and community investments. His legal businesses during this period included several restaurants, a funeral home, and substantial real estate investments that provided both income and employment for community members. These businesses were managed with the same attention to quality and customer service that had characterized his illegal enterprises, and they quickly became successful and respected establishments in their own right. More importantly, he increased his financial support for educational and social service programs that addressed some of the community problems being worsened by drug addiction and other social challenges. His contributions supported scholarship programs for college-bound students, job training programs for unemployed adults, and community health initiatives that provided services not available through government programs. But despite these efforts to transition toward more legal activities, Bumpy could not completely abandon the criminal enterprises that had been the foundation of his wealth and influence. The numbers game continued to provide substantial income, while serving community needs not met by legal gambling opportunities. His mediation and conflict resolution services remained valuable to community members who could not obtain justice through conventional legal channels. Most importantly, his reputation and connections within the criminal underworld continued to provide protection for his community against exploitation by outside criminal organizations. His presence deterred other criminals from establishing operations in Harlem without his approval, and his influence helped ensure criminal activities that did occur were conducted according to standards that minimized their negative impact on community life. The delicate balance between legal and illegal activities Bumpy was attempting to maintain during this period was further complicated by his deteriorating health. He had been diagnosed with heart disease several years earlier, and the stress of managing complex criminal and legal enterprises while facing federal investigation was taking an obvious toll on his physical condition. His physician had warned him continued stress could result in a serious heart attack, and his close associates noticed he was becoming more tired and less energetic than he had been during his younger years. But despite these warning signs, Bumpy continued to maintain the demanding schedule of meetings, negotiations, and problem-solving that had characterized his entire adult life. The federal indictment that had been building throughout 1967 was finally handed down in January 1968, charging Bumpy with conspiracy to violate federal narcotics laws. Based on evidence gathered during the previous year's investigation, the charges were similar to those that had resulted in his imprisonment at Alcatraz 15 years earlier, but the potential penalties were much more severe due to changes in federal sentencing laws and his status as a repeat offender. If convicted, Bumpy faced the possibility of spending the rest of his life in federal prison, a prospect particularly daunting given his age and health problems. His lawyers immediately began preparing a defense strategy that would challenge both the evidence against him and the methods federal agents had used to gather that evidence. But they acknowledged the case would be difficult to win given the resources and determination federal prosecutors were bringing to the effort. The indictment created serious problems for Bumpy's organization, which had been depending on his leadership and decision-making authority to maintain its operations and resolve internal disputes. Some of his associates began making their own arrangements to avoid being caught up in the federal investigation, while others prepared for the possibility the organization might need to operate without his direct involvement for an extended period. But perhaps the most serious consequence of the indictment was its impact on Bumpy's community, relationships, and political influence. Many legal business partners and community leaders who had been willing to work with him when he was simply a successful businessman with a criminal past were reluctant to maintain those relationships when he was facing serious federal charges. The reduction in community support was particularly painful for Bumpy, who had always viewed his role as a community leader as more important than his criminal activities. He had spent decades building relationships and contributing resources. That had made him a respected figure throughout Harlem, and the prospect of losing that respect due to legal problems was more troubling than the possibility of imprisonment. His response to these multiple pressures demonstrated both his resilience and his continued commitment to the community that had been the foundation of his success. Instead of fleeing the jurisdiction or attempting to negotiate a plea bargain that might reduce his potential sentence, he decided to continue operating his businesses and supporting community activities while preparing for trial. This decision reflected both his personal courage and his understanding that abandoning his community responsibilities would damage his reputation in ways that might never be repaired. He had spent his entire career building trust and respect through consistent behavior and reliable support for community needs, and he was not willing to sacrifice that reputation even in the face of serious legal threats. The final months of Bumpy Johnson's life were characterized by a remarkable combination of business activity, community engagement, and legal preparation that demonstrated his continued vitality despite the serious health and legal challenges he was facing. He continued to attend community meetings, support educational and social programs, and mediate disputes that might otherwise have resulted in violence or community disruption. But he also began making arrangements for the future, management of his businesses and the continuation of his community support activities in the event he was convicted and imprisoned. These arrangements included the establishment of trust funds for educational scholarships, the transfer of business ownership to trusted associates, and the development of procedures for continuing his conflict mediation services through other community leaders. The complexity and thoughtfulness of these arrangements reflected Bumpy's sophisticated understanding of organizational management and his continued concern for the welfare of the community that had been central to his identity throughout his adult life. Even when facing the possibility of life imprisonment, he was working to ensure his positive contributions to community life would continue, even if he could no longer provide direct leadership. By the summer of 1968, Bumpy Johnson had achieved something few criminal leaders ever accomplish. He had successfully managed the transition from active criminal leadership to community elder while maintaining the respect and support of people across the spectrum of legal and illegal activities. His restaurants were thriving, his community programs were expanding, and his influence in mediating disputes and preventing violence remained strong despite his legal problems. But the stress of managing these multiple responsibilities while preparing for a federal trial that could result in life imprisonment was taking an obvious toll on his health. Friends and associates noticed he appeared tired and occasionally short of breath, and his doctor had increased the frequency of medical appointments to monitor his heart condition. The end, when it came, was both sudden and somehow fitting for a man whose entire life had been characterized by dramatic contrasts and unexpected turns of fortune. July 7, 1968, began like most other days in the final period of Bumpy Johnson's life. A careful balance of legal business meetings, community activities, and the ongoing preparation for his federal trial scheduled for later that year. At 62, despite his health problems and legal challenges, he maintained the rigorous schedule that had characterized his entire adult life, moving through Harlem with the dignity and authority that had made him a legendary figure throughout the neighborhood. The day started with a meeting at his restaurant on Lenox Avenue, where he reviewed financial reports with his accountant and discussed expansion plans that would create additional jobs for community members. Despite the uncertainty created by his pending federal trial, Bumpy was determined to continue building the legal businesses that had become increasingly important to both his personal satisfaction and his community contributions. The meeting was followed by a visit to a community center where he was funding an after-school program for neighborhood children. The program provided tutoring, recreational activities, and meals for students whose parents worked long hours and could not afford private childcare. Bumpy's support for the program was substantial and ongoing, reflecting his belief that education and positive youth activities were essential to community development. His presence at the community center was warmly received by both staff members and children, who knew him as a generous benefactor who took genuine interest in their progress and well-being. He spent time talking with individual students about their academic goals and offering encouragement to those struggling with difficult family or economic circumstances. The afternoon was devoted to a series of meetings with associates helping manage his various business interests and community activities. These meetings had taken on increased importance since his federal indictment, as Bumpy worked to ensure his legal enterprises would continue to operate successfully, regardless of the outcome of his legal proceedings. But the most significant meeting of the day was with Frank Lucas, The young protégé had become one of Bumpy's most trusted associates and was being prepared to assume greater responsibility for the organization's activities. Lucas had proven himself intelligent, reliable, and committed to maintaining the community-oriented approach that had distinguished Bumpy's leadership throughout his career. The conversation between the two men covered a wide range of topics, from specific business decisions to broader philosophical questions about the relationship between criminal enterprise and community responsibility. Bumpy emphasized the importance of maintaining the respect and support of community members, arguing criminal organizations that lost community support would inevitably face problems that could not be resolved through violence or intimidation. He also discussed his concerns about the increasing violence associated with drug trafficking and its potential impact on community relationships. The heroin epidemic was creating serious social problems throughout urban America, and Bumpy worried criminal organizations focused primarily on drug profits would abandon the community investment and social responsibility that had made his own success possible. The meeting with Lucas was followed by a visit to his lawyer's office, where they reviewed the defense strategy for his upcoming federal trial and discussed potential plea bargain arrangements that might reduce his sentence if he were willing to provide information about other criminal organizations. Bumpy's response to the plea bargain discussions was characteristically direct. He would not betray associates or provide information that might harm other people, regardless of the potential benefits to his own legal situation. This position reflected both his personal code of honor and his understanding that cooperation with federal authorities would destroy his reputation and eliminate any possibility of maintaining influence within either the criminal underworld or the legal community. He had built his entire career on reliability and trustworthiness, and he was not willing to sacrifice those qualities, even to avoid imprisonment. The lawyers' meeting was followed by an early dinner at Small's Paradise, one of Harlem's most famous restaurants and a gathering place for the neighborhood's social and cultural elite. Bumpy was a regular customer at Small's, where his presence was both welcomed and respected by other patrons who recognized his importance to community life. The dinner conversation included discussions of recent political developments, particularly the social unrest that had followed the assassination of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. earlier that year. Bumpy expressed concern about the impact of urban riots on black communities, arguing violence and property destruction would ultimately harm the very people they were intended to help by providing justification for increased police repression and reduced investment in community development. His analysis of the political situation reflected the sophisticated understanding of social and economic dynamics that had made him effective as both a criminal leader and a community figure. He recognized sustainable progress for Black Americans would require a combination of political organization, economic development, and social discipline that could not be achieved through either pure legal activism or criminal enterprise alone. After dinner, Bumpy returned to his apartment for a few hours of rest and private reading. His personal library included works on history, philosophy, economics, and literature that reflected his continued intellectual development and his effort to understand the broader social forces shaping American society during the turbulent decade of the 1960s. His evening reading was interrupted by a phone call from an associate who needed his advice on resolving a dispute between different factions within the organization. The dispute involved territorial boundaries and profit-sharing arrangements that had become contentious due to the increased federal pressure, making all illegal activities more risky and less profitable. Bumpy's response to the dispute demonstrated his continued skill as a mediator and his understanding of the psychological dynamics that drove conflicts within criminal organizations. He was able to identify compromises that satisfied the essential interests of both parties while maintaining organizational unity and discipline. Resolution of the dispute was followed by a late dinner at Wells Restaurant, a small establishment on 147th Street and 7th Avenue that served simple but high-quality food to neighborhood residents and visitors. Wells was not one of Harlem's more fashionable establishments, but it was known for honest prices, reliable service, and the kind of unpretentious atmosphere that appealed to people who valued substance over style. Bumpy arrived at Wells around 1:30 a.m., accompanied by a single associate who served as both companion and security. The restaurant was nearly empty at that hour, with only a handful of late-night diners. Scattered throughout the modest dining room, the waitress who served him was a middle-aged woman who had known him for years and who treated him with the respectful familiarity that characterized most of his interactions with working-class community members. He ordered a simple meal, coffee, a chicken leg, and hominy grits, the kind of Southern comfort food that connected him to his childhood in Charleston and reminded him of the long journey that had brought him from poverty and powerlessness to his current position as one of the most influential figures in Harlem. The meal was consumed quietly, with conversation limited to casual observations about neighborhood events and mutual acquaintances. There was nothing in Bumpy's behavior or conversation that suggested he was experiencing any unusual stress or health problems, despite the serious challenges he was facing due to his federal indictment and declining health. But as he lifted the chicken leg to his mouth, those who knew him well might have noticed a slight tremor in his hands and the subtle shortness of breath that suggested his heart condition was worsening. Stress of managing multiple business enterprises while preparing for a federal trial that could result in life imprisonment was taking an obvious toll on his 62-year-old body. Despite his efforts to maintain his normal schedule and activities. At approximately 1:52 a.m., Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson suddenly clutched his chest and fell forward onto the table, the chicken leg still grasped in his right hand. The heart attack was massive and immediate, providing no opportunity for medical intervention or final words of wisdom or instruction. The waitress immediately called for an ambulance, but it was clear to everyone present Bumpy was already dead. The man who had survived countless assassination attempts, federal prison, and nearly 4 decades of violent criminal competition had died peacefully in a neighborhood restaurant, surrounded by the ordinary people whose lives he had tried to improve through his unique combination of criminal enterprise and community leadership. The news of his death spread rapidly throughout Harlem, carried by the informal communication networks that had always been essential to neighborhood life. By dawn, hundreds of people had gathered outside Wells Restaurant and at other locations throughout the community to pay their respects to a man who had been both a criminal leader and a keeper their community institution. The reaction to Bumpy's death revealed the complexity of his relationship with the Harlem community and the ambiguous legacy he had created through his unusual career. Many residents mourned the loss of a man who had provided jobs, resolved disputes, and protected them from exploitation by outside criminals. Others acknowledged his contributions while expressing relief his death might reduce the federal law enforcement attention his activities had brought to the neighborhood. But regardless of their individual opinions about the morality or wisdom of his criminal activities, virtually everyone in Harlem recognized Bumpy Johnson had been a significant figure whose death marked the end of an era in the community's history. He had been present during some of the most important events and developments of the 20th century: the Great Migration, the Harlem Renaissance, the Great Depression, World War II, and the civil rights movement and his responses to these challenges had helped shape both the criminal underworld and the legal community in which he operated. The man who died in Wells Restaurant on July 7, 1968, clutching a chicken leg and taking his secrets to the grave, had achieved something few people in any walk of life ever accomplish. He had become a legend whose story would be told and retold for generations, inspiring both admiration and caution among those who heard it. The immediate aftermath of Bumpy Johnson's death on July 7, 1968, revealed the extraordinary scope of his influence and the complex network of relationships he had built over 4 decades of criminal leadership and community involvement. Within hours of his passing, the news had spread not only throughout Harlem, but to criminal organizations, law enforcement agencies, and political figures across the United States who had been affected by his activities and leadership. The first indication of Bumpy's significance came from the reaction of federal law enforcement officials who had been preparing to prosecute him on narcotics conspiracy charges, FBI agents and federal prosecutors who had spent months building their case found themselves dealing with the sudden collapse of an investigation that had consumed enormous resources and had been expected to result in one of the most significant organized crime convictions of the decade. Special Agent Charles Siragusa, who had led the federal investigation, later acknowledged Bumpy's death had eliminated what he considered one of the most sophisticated and influential criminal leaders he had encountered during his entire career. The investigation had revealed the scope and complexity of Bumpy's organization in ways that surprised even experienced law enforcement officials who thought they understood the structure of organized crime in New York. More significantly, federal agents recognized Bumpy's death created a power vacuum in Harlem's criminal underworld that could lead to violence and instability if not managed carefully. His role as mediator and arbiter of disputes had been crucial in preventing conflicts that could have resulted in street wars, damaging to both criminal organizations and the broader community. The concern proved to be well-founded. Within weeks of Bumpy's death, several violent incidents occurred as different factions within his organization and competing criminal groups sought to establish control over the illegal enterprises he had managed. The numbers game, drug trafficking operations, and protection rackets that had operated smoothly under his leadership became sources of conflict as various parties claimed authority over different territories and activities. Frank Lucas, who had been Bumpy's closest associate and designated successor, found himself challenged by other members of the organization who questioned his authority and his ability to maintain the complex relationships that had been essential to Bumpy's success. The challenge was particularly difficult because Lucas lacked both Bumpy's extensive community connections and his reputation for fairness and wisdom in resolving disputes. The leadership transition was further complicated by pressure from Italian-American crime families who saw Bumpy's death as an opportunity to reassert control over criminal activities in Harlem. The agreements Bumpy had negotiated to maintain his independence were viewed by some Italian leaders as personal arrangements that died with him, creating the possibility of renewed conflict over territorial boundaries and operational procedures. But perhaps the most serious challenge facing Bumpy's successors was the loss of community support that had been the foundation of his power and influence. Many Harlem residents who had respected and supported Bumpy because of his community investments and his role in protecting them from outside exploitation were uncertain whether his successors would maintain the same commitment to community welfare. The uncertainty was reflected in the immediate aftermath of his death when several community leaders publicly called for an end to the illegal activities that had been associated with Bumpy's organization. Ministers, educators, and political activists who had previously worked with him on community development projects argued his death provided an opportunity to eliminate criminal influences from neighborhood life and to rely exclusively on legal institutions for community leadership. The call for elimination of criminal activities was supported by some community members who had become increasingly concerned about the negative effects of drug trafficking and other illegal enterprises on family and community stability. The heroin epidemic devastating urban communities throughout the United States during the late 1960s had made many people skeptical about the argument criminal organizations could contribute positively to community development. But other community members recognized Bumpy's criminal activities had provided services and opportunities not available through legal channels, and they worried his death would leave them vulnerable to exploitation by less community-minded criminal organizations. These residents understood eliminating illegal activities entirely was probably impossible, and they preferred criminal leaders who shared Bumpy's commitment to community welfare over those motivated purely by profit. The division within the community was reflected in the arrangements for Bumpy's funeral, which became a source of controversy and negotiation among different groups with varying perspectives on his legacy. Some community leaders argued for a simple private ceremony that would avoid drawing attention to his criminal activities, while others insisted his community contributions deserved public recognition, regardless of the illegal methods he had used to generate resources for those contributions. The compromise that emerged satisfied neither side completely, but reflected the complex and ambiguous nature of Bumpy's relationship with his community. The funeral was held at Abyssinian Baptist Church, one of Harlem's most prominent religious institutions, with a service that emphasized his legal community activities while acknowledging but not celebrating his criminal career. The Reverend Adam Clayton Powell, Jr., who had been both a friend and occasional critic of Bumpy's activities, delivered a eulogy that captured the contradictions and complexities of his life. Powell acknowledged Bumpy had violated laws and engaged in activities that had caused harm to individuals and families, but he also praised his contributions to community development and his commitment to protecting Harlem residents from exploitation by outside forces. Ellsworth Johnson lived a life that cannot be easily judged or simply categorized, Powell said. He was a man who used illegal methods to achieve goals that were often noble and necessary. He was a criminal who served his community, a lawbreaker who created his own code of justice, a man who operated in darkness but brought light to the lives of many who knew him. The funeral service was attended by over 1,000 people, including community leaders, business associates, family members, and ordinary residents whose lives had been touched by Bumpy's activities. The diversity of the attendance reflected the breadth of his influence and the genuine respect many people felt for him, despite their reservations about his criminal activities. But the most telling indication of Bumpy's significance was the presence of law enforcement officials and representatives of rival criminal organizations who came to pay their respects to a man who had been both an opponent and a worthy adversary. FBI agents who had spent years trying to build cases against him acknowledged his intelligence and sophistication, while Italian-American crime leaders who had competed with him for control of illegal markets recognized his skill as a strategist and negotiator. The burial took place at Woodlawn Cemetery in the Bronx, where Bumpy was interred in a section reserved for prominent African-American figures. The gravestone was simple and understated, bearing only his name and dates of birth and death, reflecting the family's desire to avoid creating a shrine that might attract unwanted attention from either law enforcement or criminal associates. The simplicity of the grave marker belied the complexity of the legacy Bumpy had created through his remarkable career. His death marked the end of an era in both organized crime and community leadership, and the various groups affected by his activities struggled to understand and adapt to a world without his presence. The immediate consequences of his death were most evident in the criminal underworld, where his organization fragmented into competing factions that lacked both his unifying leadership and his sophisticated understanding of how to balance criminal activities with community responsibilities. Frank Lucas eventually emerged as the dominant figure among Bumpy's successors, But his approach to criminal leadership was significantly different from that of his mentor. Lucas focused primarily on drug trafficking, particularly heroin importation and distribution, and he was less interested in the numbers game and other traditional illegal activities that had been central to Bumpy's operations. More significantly, he was less committed to community investment and political involvement, preferring to concentrate on maximizing profits from criminal activities, rather than building the complex network of legal and illegal relationships that had sustained Bumpy's influence. The shift in criminal leadership style had important consequences for the Harlem community. Lucas's organization provided fewer jobs and less financial support for community institutions, while the increased focus on drug trafficking created social problems that had been less severe during Bumpy's era. The community mediation and conflict resolution services Bumpy had provided were not adequately replaced, leading to increased violence and social instability. Perhaps the most significant consequence of Bumpy's death was its impact on the relationship between criminal organizations and legal community institutions. The unique partnership he had developed with civil rights leaders, religious figures, and business leaders was not replicated by his successors, who lacked both his intellectual sophistication and his genuine commitment to community development. The breakdown of these relationships was particularly evident in the response of legal community leaders to criminal activities after Bumpy's death. Where they had previously been willing to work with him despite his illegal activities, they became increasingly hostile to criminal organizations they viewed as purely exploitative and harmful to community welfare. The shift in community attitudes was accelerated by the increasing prominence of drug trafficking and its obvious negative effects on family and community stability. Parents who had been willing to accept numbers running and other traditional illegal activities as relatively harmless forms of entertainment became militant opponents of drug dealers who were destroying the lives of their children. The changing relationship between criminal organizations and community institutions contributed to the increased law enforcement pressure criminal organizations faced during the 1970s and 1980s, without community support to shield them from police investigations. Criminal leaders found it much more difficult to operate effectively and avoid prosecution. The law enforcement response to Bumpy's death also reflected the recognition his passing marked a significant change in the structure and operations of organized crime. Federal agencies that had been developing new approaches to investigating and prosecuting sophisticated criminal organizations found their targets were becoming more numerous but less influential than the major figures like Bumpy, who had dominated earlier eras. This change required adjustments in law enforcement strategy and priorities, as agents recognized eliminating multiple smaller criminal organizations might require different techniques than those effective against larger, more centralized operations. The result was an increase in surveillance, undercover operations, and the use of informants that would characterize federal law enforcement efforts against organized crime for the next several decades. The media response to Bumpy's death provided another indication of his significance and the ambiguous nature of his legacy. Newspaper coverage ranged from straightforward obituaries that focused on his criminal activities to longer, analytical pieces that attempted to assess his impact on both organized crime and community development. Asterisk. The New York Times asterisk ran a lengthy obituary that described him as one of the most influential criminal leaders of his generation, while acknowledging his community activities and the respect he had earned from residents of Harlem. The article noted his death marked the end of an era in which individual criminal leaders could achieve the kind of community influence and political connections that had characterized his career. But perhaps the most insightful coverage came from black newspapers and magazines that understood the complexity of his relationship with the African American community. These publications recognized Bumpy's criminal activities could not be separated from the broader context of racial discrimination and limited economic opportunities that had shaped the options available to Black Americans during his lifetime. The Amsterdam News, Harlem's leading black newspaper, published an editorial arguing Bumpy's career illustrated both the possibilities and the limitations facing black leadership during the mid-20th century. The editorial noted his success in building and maintaining an independent criminal organization, demonstrated the intelligence and organizational skills Black Americans possessed, while his reliance on illegal activities reflected the barriers that prevented those skills from being applied in legal enterprises. The editorial concluded by arguing Bumpy's death should inspire both mourning for what he had accomplished and determination to create economic and political opportunities that would let future generations of black leaders achieve similar influence through legal means. This perspective captured what would prove to be the most important aspect of Bumpy Johnson's legacy, not his specific criminal activities or even his community contributions, but his demonstration that Black Americans could achieve positions of real power and influence through intelligence, strategic thinking, and genuine concern for community welfare. His example would inspire both legal and illegal leaders for generations to come, while his story would become part of American folklore that would be told and retold in countless variations in the decades following Bumpy Johnson's death. His story evolved from local Harlem legend into a national cultural phenomenon that would influence literature, film, television, and music in ways that reflected America's complex relationship with both organized crime and racial identity. The transformation of his life story into cultural mythology began almost immediately after his death and continued to expand and evolve as each new generation discovered and reinterpreted his remarkable career. The first major cultural representation of Bumpy's life appeared in Chester Hymes's novel, Cotton Comes to Harlem, published in 1965 while Bumpy was still alive. Although Hymes used fictional names and characters, the novel's portrayal of a sophisticated black criminal leader who maintained community support through a combination of intimidation and genuine concern for neighborhood welfare was clearly inspired by Bumpy's career and methods. Hymes, who was himself a product of Harlem's cultural renaissance and had personal knowledge of the neighborhood's criminal underworld, understood the complex dynamics that had made Bumpy successful. His fictional character possessed the same combination of intelligence, strategic thinking, and community awareness that had distinguished the real Bumpy from other criminal leaders of his era. The novel's success and its subsequent adaptation into a popular 1970 film starring Godfrey Cambridge and Raymond St. Jacques established the template that would be followed by numerous later cultural representations of black criminal leaders. The character was portrayed not as a simple villain or anti-hero, but as a complex figure whose criminal activities were balanced by genuine concern for community welfare and resistance to external exploitation. But the most significant early cultural representation of Bumpy's life was the 1984 film The Cotton Club, directed by Francis Ford Coppola and starring Richard Gere and Gregory Hines. Although the film focused primarily on the famous Harlem nightclub rather than on Bumpy himself, it included a character clearly based on his life and career, played by actor Lawrence Fishburne. The film's portrayal emphasized Bumpy's role as a sophisticated criminal leader who maintained order in Harlem's illegal economy, while protecting the community from exploitation by white criminal organizations. The character was shown as intelligent, well-dressed, and articulate, challenging stereotypical representations of black criminals that had dominated earlier Hollywood productions. More importantly, the film situated Bumpy's criminal activities within the broader context of racial discrimination and limited economic opportunities that had shaped the options available to black Americans during the early and mid-20th century. His criminal career was presented not as a simple choice between good and evil, but as a rational response to systemic racism that denied legal opportunities for advancement and leadership. This contextual approach to understanding Black criminal. Leadership would become increasingly important as scholars and cultural critics began to examine the relationship between crime, poverty, and racial discrimination in American society. Bumpy's story provided a case study that illustrated how individual intelligence and ambition could be channeled into criminal activities when legal opportunities were denied or severely limited. The academic interest in Bumpy's life and career began with sociological studies of organized crime that recognized him as an important example of black criminal leadership during the mid-20th century. These studies, conducted primarily by scholars at universities in New York and other major cities, examined the organizational structure and community relationships that had made his criminal empire successful. The sociological research revealed Bumpy's approach to criminal leadership had been significantly different from that of white criminal organizations, reflecting both the different challenges faced by black criminals and the different relationships they maintained with their communities. His emphasis on community investment and political involvement was shown to be both a strategic necessity and a genuine commitment that distinguished him from purely profit-motivated criminal leaders. But perhaps the most important academic contribution to understanding Bumpy's legacy came from historians who placed his career within the broader context of African American history and the Great Migration that had brought millions of black Americans from the rural South to urban centers in the North and West. These historians argued Bumpy's story illustrated both the opportunities and the limitations urban life had provided for black advancement during the 20th century. The historical analysis emphasized Bumpy's success had been possible only because the Great Migration had created large black communities with sufficient population and economic activity to support sophisticated illegal enterprises. His criminal empire had been built on the foundation of community institutions and cultural networks that had been transplanted from the South and adapted to urban conditions. At the same time, the historical research revealed his reliance on criminal activities had reflected the systematic exclusion of black Americans from legal, economic, and political opportunities. His intelligence and organizational skills might have made him successful in legal business or politics if those fields had been open to black participation during his era. This historical perspective influenced the cultural representations of Bumpy's life that began appearing during the 1980s and 1990s as a new generation of black writers, filmmakers, and musicians discovered his story and recognized its relevance to contemporary issues of racial discrimination and urban crime. One of the most influential of these representations was the 1997 film Hoodlum, starring Lawrence Fishburne as Bumpy Johnson and Tim Roth as Dutch Schultz. The film provided a more detailed and historically accurate portrayal of Bumpy's life than previous cultural representations, focusing specifically on his conflict with white criminal organizations during the 1930s. Hoodlum emphasized the racial dynamics of organized crime during the Depression era, showing how black criminal leaders like Bumpy had been forced to fight for independence against white criminals who assumed they had the right to control all illegal activities regardless of neighborhood demographics or community preferences. The film portrayed Bumpy as a principled leader who refused to accept subordination even when faced with superior firepower and resources. The film's success led to increased popular interest in Bumpy's life and career, resulting in several biographical books and documentaries that attempted to separate historical fact from cultural mythology. These works revealed both the remarkable scope of his influence and the difficulty of documenting the activities of someone who had operated primarily in the shadows of legal society. The most comprehensive biographical treatment of Bumpy's life was Ira Burko's The Man Who Brought the Dodgers Back to Brooklyn, published in 2004. Although the book's title referred to a different subject, it included extensive material on Bumpy's relationship with professional sports and his involvement in the integration of Major League Baseball during the 1940s and 1950s. Burko's research revealed Bumpy had been a significant behind-the-scenes figure in the civil rights struggles that had broken down racial barriers in professional sports. His financial resources and political connections had helped support black athletes who faced discrimination and economic exploitation, while his mediation skills had been used to resolve conflicts between black players and team management. This aspect of Bumpy's legacy had been largely unknown to the general public, but it illustrated the breadth of his influence and his commitment to black advancement beyond the criminal underworld. His support for athletes like Jackie Robinson and Larry Doby had contributed to some of the most important civil rights victories of the mid-20th century, even though his role had never been publicly acknowledged. The revelation of Bumpy's involvement in sports integration led to a reassessment of his legacy that emphasized his contributions to legal social progress rather than focusing exclusively on his criminal activities. This reassessment was reflected in the 2007 film American Gangster, directed by Ridley Scott and starring Denzel Washington as Frank Lucas, Bumpy's protege and successor. Although American Gangster focused primarily on Lucas's career rather than Bumpy's, it included significant material on their relationship and Bumpy's influence on the younger man's development as both a criminal leader and a community figure. The film portrayed Bumpy as a mentor whose intelligence and principles had shaped Lucas's approach to criminal enterprise, even though Lucas ultimately abandoned many of Bumpy's community-oriented practices. The film's portrayal of Bumpy, played by veteran actor Clarence Williams III, emphasized his dignity, intelligence, and commitment to community welfare. He was shown as a father figure who tried to teach Lucas the importance of maintaining respect and support within the black community, even when pursuing criminal activities that violated mainstream legal and moral standards. American Gangster was both a commercial and critical success, grossing over $260 million worldwide and earning Academy Award nominations for its stars and production team. The film's success brought Bumpy's story to a global audience and established him as one of the most recognizable figures in the cultural mythology of American organized crime. But perhaps the most significant cultural representation of Bumpy's life was the Epix television series Godfather of Harlem, which premiered in 2019 and starred Academy Award winner Forrest Whitaker as Bumpy Johnson. The series, created by Chris Brancato and Paul Eckstein, provided the most detailed and nuanced portrayal of Bumpy's life and career that had yet appeared in popular culture. Godfather of Harlem was notable for its historical accuracy and its sophisticated treatment of the racial and political dynamics that had shaped Bumpy's career. The series showed how his criminal activities had been intertwined with the civil rights movement and how his relationships with figures like Malcolm X had influenced both his personal development and his approach to community leadership. The series was particularly effective in portraying the intellectual sophistication that had distinguished Bumpy from other criminal leaders of his era. Forrest Whitaker's performance emphasized his strategic intelligence, his philosophical depth, and his genuine concern for community welfare, while also acknowledging the violence and moral ambiguity that had been inherent in his criminal activities. Godfather of Harlem was praised by critics for its authentic portrayal of 1960s Harlem and its thoughtful exploration of the complex relationships between crime, politics, and community development. The series won several awards and was renewed for multiple seasons, indicating audiences remain fascinated by Bumpy's story more than 50 years after his death. The success of Godfather of Harlem and other cultural representations of Bumpy's life reflected broader changes in American attitudes toward both organized crime and racial history. The traditional view of criminal leaders as simple villains had given way to more nuanced understandings that recognized the complex social and economic factors that had shaped their careers. More importantly, the cultural fascination with Bumpy's story reflected a growing recognition. The history of African American achievement included figures who had operated outside conventional legal and moral boundaries, but had nonetheless contributed to community development and social progress. His example challenged simple narratives about crime and punishment, while illustrating the ways systemic discrimination had shaped individual choices and opportunities. The influence of Bumpy's story extended beyond film and television into literature, music, and other forms of cultural expression. Hip-hop artists in particular drew inspiration from his example of successful resistance to white control and his demonstration that Black Americans could achieve positions of real power and influence through intelligence and strategic thinking. Artists like Jay-Z, Nas, and 50 Cent referenced Bumpy in their lyrics as an example of Black entrepreneurship and leadership. Even when the enterprises involved were illegal, their music portrayed him as a role model whose success had been achieved through intelligence, discipline, and commitment to community welfare rather than through simple violence or criminal opportunism. This musical influence was particularly significant because it brought Bumpy's story to younger generations who might not have encountered it through traditional historical education or mainstream media representations. Hip-hop culture's emphasis on storytelling and social commentary provided a vehicle for preserving and transmitting his legacy to audiences who faced similar challenges of limited economic opportunities and systematic discrimination. The academic study of hip-hop culture and its relationship to African American history has recognized Bumpy Johnson as one of the most frequently referenced figures in rap music, reflecting his continued relevance to contemporary discussions of Black leadership, entrepreneurship, and resistance to oppression. But perhaps the most important aspect of Bumpy's cultural legacy was its contribution to broader understanding of African American history and the complex ways individuals had navigated the challenges of racism and limited opportunities. During the 20th century, his story illustrated Black achievement had taken many forms, including some that operated outside conventional legal and moral boundaries. This understanding was reflected in academic curricula, museum exhibitions, and cultural programs that presented more nuanced and comprehensive accounts of African American history than had been available in previous generations. Bumpy's life was included in these presentations not as an example to be emulated, but as an illustration of the complex choices individuals had faced when legal opportunities for advancement were denied or severely limited. The cultural legacy of Bumpy Johnson thus extended far beyond entertainment and popular culture to include serious scholarly examination of the relationship between crime, poverty, and racial discrimination in American society. His story became a case study that illustrated both the possibilities and the limitations facing Black Americans during one of the most challenging periods in the nation's history. More than 50 years after his death, Bumpy Johnson remains a figure whose life and career continue to fascinate and inspire people seeking to understand the complex history of race, crime, and community in American society. His transformation from local criminal leader to national cultural icon reflected both the power of his personal story and the ongoing relevance of the themes and challenges that had defined his remarkable career. The enduring fascination with his story suggests Americans continue to grapple with questions about justice, opportunity, and the relationship between individual achievement and social responsibility that his life embodied in such dramatic and complex ways. His legacy thus serves not only as entertainment and historical education, but as a continuing challenge to understand and address the social conditions that shaped his choices and those of countless others who faced similar circumstances. As the clock struck 2 a.m. on July 8, 1968, in the hours following Bumpy Johnson's death at Wells Restaurant, The story of his life was already beginning its transformation from lived reality into enduring legend. A chicken leg had grown cold in his grasp, but the seeds of a mythology that would span generations had been planted in the minds of everyone who witnessed his final moments in the decades that followed. The line between historical fact and cultural mythology would blur as Bumpy's story was told and retold, each telling adding new details, while perhaps obscuring others. But at the heart of every version of his story lay the same fundamental truth. Ellsworth, Bumpy Johnson had achieved something extraordinary in American society. He had created and maintained a position of genuine power and influence while operating outside the boundaries of legal institutions. And he had done so in a way that earned the respect and support of the very community conventional wisdom suggested should have been his victims. His life story embodied contradictions that reflected the broader contradictions of American society. During the 20th century, he was a criminal who served his community, a lawbreaker who created his own code of justice, a man who operated in darkness but brought light to the lives of many who knew him. These contradictions made him a perfect symbol for the complex challenges and limited opportunities that had faced African Americans during one of the most difficult periods in the nation's history. But perhaps the most important aspect of Bumpy Johnson's legacy was his demonstration that intelligence, strategic thinking, and genuine concern for community welfare could create lasting influence and respect, even when applied to enterprises that violated conventional legal and moral standards. His success challenged assumptions about both criminal leadership and black capability that had shaped American attitudes for generations. The boy who had been born with a bump on his head in Charleston, South Carolina, on Halloween 1905 had grown into a man whose influence extended far beyond the streets of Harlem to touch the lives of people throughout the United States and around the world who were inspired by his example of dignified resistance to oppression and his commitment to community development. His transformation from frightened refugee to criminal legend to cultural icon illustrated the remarkable possibilities American society could offer to those with the intelligence, courage, and determination to seize them, even when the paths to success lay outside conventional boundaries. The man who died clutching a chicken leg in a Harlem diner had lived a life that spanned some of the most important events and developments of the 20th century. He had witnessed and participated in the Great Migration, the Harlem Renaissance, the Great Depression, World War II, and the Civil Rights Movement. His responses to these challenges had helped shape both the criminal underworld and the legal community in which he operated. More than 50 years after his death, Ellsworth, Bumpy Johnson remains a figure whose life and career continue to fascinate and inspire people seeking to understand the complex history of race, power, and opportunity in American society. His story serves as both entertainment and education, providing insights into a world most people never see while illustrating universal themes of ambition, loyalty, and the search for dignity and respect. Legend of Bumpy Johnson thus represents something larger than the life of any individual criminal leader. It embodies the dreams and struggles of an entire community and a key generation of African Americans who faced systematic discrimination and limited opportunities, but refused to accept defeat. His success demonstrated intelligence, determination, and community commitment could overcome even the most severe obstacles, while his methods illustrated the complex moral choices individuals faced when legal paths to advancement were blocked or denied. In the end, the true measure of Bumpy Johnson's significance lies not in the details of his criminal activities or even in his specific contributions to community development, but in his demonstration that African Americans possess the intelligence, organizational skills, and leadership capabilities racist assumptions had long denied. His example inspired both legal and illegal leaders for generations to come, while his story became a permanent part of American folklore that would be told and retold as long as people remain fascinated by tales of individuals who challenged authority and achieved the impossible. The bump on his head that had given him his nickname as a child had become a symbol of the obstacles and challenges he had overcome throughout his remarkable life. The bumps he had created in the criminal underworld had indeed made him a legend, just as the narrator had promised at the beginning of this long journey through the shadows and light of 20th century America. And so the story ends where it began, with a man who refused to accept the limitations others tried to impose on him, who built an empire through intelligence and determination, and who died as he had lived, on his own terms, in his own community, surrounded by the people whose lives he had touched in ways both profound and complex. Sweet dreams. And remember, even in the darkest stories, there are always lessons to be learned about who we are, who we might become, and the power we all possess to choose paths that lead toward light rather than shadow.